Chapter 1. If one were to look at Eastwood from space, it would be a beautiful planet. The blue sea water and endless green fields on the surface of the planet, as well as the pale white mining pits that made one's heart palpitate, would reveal an indescribable hazy beauty when illuminated by the light of the stars that shone through the particles in the sky. It was like an oil painting that had been left for many years, covered with the dust of history. However, to the residents and orphans of Eastwood, the planet was only filled with stones. Other than stones, there was nothing else. Even the green fields, in the eyes of their perseverance that gradually turned numb, were just green turf covered with wealth and glorious history. Their eyes were only used to seeing through the turf, looking directly at the mineral veins that the people of Eastwood yearned for the most. In terms of administrative planning, Eastwood was a second-level administrative region. It had the same administrative level as the three dazzling planets in the Capital Ring and the West Woods region. However, in the hearts of the people of the Federation, the distant Eastwood was actually a forgotten corner. Other than seeing the name of Eastwood at the celebration of the 600th anniversary of the establishment of the Federation government, most of the time, for those who lived in a wealthy and civilized society, Eastwood no longer existed. The Eastwood region only had one planet, Planet Eastwood. This seemed to be nonsense, but it was actually not nonsense because the origin of the name of the Eastwood region was Planet Eastwood. It could be seen that in the distant past, this lonely planet hanging at the outermost edge of the triangular star system had an important meaning to the entire human society. However, ever since the various types of ores in the Eastwood region were mined out, Planet Eastwood gradually became a barren planet. There were only stones, no ores, only stones. People who had the ability to leave Eastwood had already left. Relying on their professional skills and accumulated wealth, as well as the guarantee of their relatives in the Capital Ring or Ceylon region, they successfully obtained a certificate of household registration transfer. Then, they boarded a flight that was becoming less and less frequent due to the lack of energy and left this increasingly lifeless place. After all, those who could obtain a household registration transfer certificate were few and far between. A half-abandoned planet still had to maintain the lives of many people. In a society with a relatively developed material civilization, food and clothing were no longer a problem for humans to worry about. The people of Donglin Planet were still living peacefully, and the social assistance system was still playing an important role. The currency was still circulating smoothly, and this world still had companies, airports, food processing plants, mech maintenance stations, computer connection centers, and even an army base. Donglin had everything that should and could have, but it still couldn't hide the faint smell of old age. The smell of death seeped out from every street, every building, and every idle person's face as they watched TV with their coffee in hand. Thousands of years of ore mining had provided endless support for the Federation society, just like a great river that transported nutrients to the plains. However, when the great river gradually dried up and became a small creek filled with stench, the support that the Federation society provided in return was clearly insufficient. After all, humans could never feel happiness just because they could live. Over thousands of years of history, the people of Donglin had cultivated perseverance and the spirit to endure hardships. The continuous mining disasters of ancient times did not make them shrink back in the slightest. However, everything in front of them made them feel a strong sense of sorrow and helplessness. There was no ore to mine, nothing to do. From a certain perspective, a life without mining disasters was definitely not the life that the people of Donglin wanted. The hardworking people of Donglin had the nickname of Donglin Stone in the Federation society. Today, the people of Donglin had become increasingly silent and indifferent stones. They had molded themselves into statues, standing in their usual round chairs and sofas at home, as if they would never move again. Soap operas are enough for the lives of the ignorant. Bao Nongtao, the deputy chief of Heshi Region's second police station, thought to himself as he walked in the cool breeze of Clocktower Street. He looked at the residents with numb expressions drinking in the tavern on the corner of the street. Deputy Chief Bao was also one of the stones of Donglin. His face was as unsmiling as a stone, and he had an endless deterrent effect on the gangs that lurked in the dark around Clocktower Street. When he was patrolling the Bell Tower Street, the peddlers selling wild beef in the black market would only flee at the sight of him at the speed of a battleship. Combined with his black uniform and the 7 subordinates behind him, it was quite eye-catching. However, Bao Longtao suddenly remembered that there were 3 reporters following him today. His heart skipped a beat, and he subconsciously fastened his collar button. He turned around with a steady rhythm and faced the female reporter holding the microphone with a smile that was uglier than crying. It was like a stone that suddenly cracked. Clocktower Street has always been safe. Bao Longtao did not want to give the female reporter the impression that he was frivolous, so he tried to speak as calmly as possible. This was a task issued by the Heshi region's governor's office, so Deputy Chief Bao did not dare to neglect it. Feeling that the chief was not used to it, the subordinates of the police public relations department naturally took over the conversation and began to talk with the reporters. Bao Longtao sighed in his heart and shook his head. He had been working in Donglin for 13 years, and he was 7 years away from the Federation government's East Assistance Ordinance. However, he really could not bear to stay in this place that was full of the smell of death for another 7 years. Did he want to be like those unemployed miners and kill time by watching TV every day? However, the Federation's regulations were very strict. Although promotion in Donglin was exceptionally fast, they had to reach a certain number of years before they could be transferred back to the Capital Ring or the West Woods region. Although Bao Longtao knew a few peripheral members of the big families, it was impossible for those cautious families to help a small chief like him. He could only work on his political achievements. Today, Deputy Chief Bao personally led the reporters to Clocktower Street because of this consideration. The trace of confusion on Deputy Chief Bao's face did not last long. It was filled with shock. He did not even hear the female reporter's curious question. His murderous gaze swept past the female reporter's shoulder and landed on the 4 exits of Clocktower Street. The reporters also noticed Deputy Chief Bao's loss of composure because Deputy Chief Bao's face was too ugly. It was ashen, like a stone in a river that had been covered in moss for decades, and could turn into some kind of terrifying monster at any time. The reporters followed Bao Longtao's gaze and immediately gasped in surprise. The female reporter, in particular, even covered her mouth and let out a soft cry. A cool breeze blew on the straight and quiet streets of Clocktower Street. At this moment, the sound of countless scattered footsteps could be heard. These footsteps were not uniform, nor did they sound like drumbeats, but they were so dense that it was impossible to tell how many people appeared at once. The next moment, the owners of these footsteps appeared on Clocktower Street. A large group of people rushed out from the 4 exits at the same time, quickly occupying most of the sidewalks and street entrances. Not only did the pedestrians on the street and a few police reporters change their expressions, but even the residents of Donglin who were addicted to coffee and alcohol looked out of the window in astonishment. To be more precise, it was a group of teenagers who rushed out from the 4 alleys. The oldest of these teenagers was only 15 or 16 years old, and some of them even had dirty patches on their faces. It was hard to tell if they were even 10 years old. These youths were wearing all kinds of clothes, but there was one that was particularly uniform. It was especially frightening, because they were all wearing black jackets, black t-shirts, and black shirts. There was a kid who looked like he couldn't find any black clothes at home, and actually found a green work uniform full of black mineral dust that hadn't been washed for God knows how many years. More than 100 teenagers of unknown origin, wearing black clothes, looked funny, but still gave off an oppressive feeling. They walked to the center of Clocktower Street and stopped in front of Deputy Director Bao and the reporters. Deputy Director Bao subconsciously took a step forward and stared fiercely at the person in front of the group of teenagers, because he knew this person. The female reporter subconsciously took a few steps back and carefully peeked at the teenagers. She did not know what these teenagers in black were doing here, and whether her safety could be guaranteed. "What are you doing here in broad daylight, not in school?" Deputy Director Bao sternly roared. Usually, when he roared, the gang leaders on Clocktower Street would piss their pants in fear. Who would have thought that these teenagers would show contempt on their faces at the same time and ignore him? The leading teenager clearly had a maturity that did not match his age. He opened his big eyes and looked at Bao Longtao without backing down, saying, "We have the right to petition." Petition. Hearing these two words, the female reporter, who was hiding behind Deputy Director Bao, suddenly became spirited. She stretched out her exquisitely made-up face and asked in a trembling voice, "What's your purpose?" The leading teenager did not immediately answer the reporter's question. Instead, he raised his fist. Suddenly, 7 or 8 slogans stretched out from the group of black-clothed teenagers, with large words written on them. They were very eye-catching. Resolutely oppose regional protectionism. Resolutely oppose TV signal control. We want to watch Channel 23 of the Federation. We want to watch Jian Shuier. The youngest boy wiped the dirt off his face and shouted a few slogans with grief and indignation. However, his voice was too clear, and his face was too cute, so he looked very cute and funny. The female reporter thought that she had caught an excellent piece of news material, but when she saw the appeal on the slogans, she was immediately dumbfounded. She looked at Deputy Director Bao in confusion and asked, Who are these kids?" Deputy Director Bao was on the verge of exploding. He withdrew his gaze from the ridiculous slogans, gritted his teeth, and cursed in a low voice, "A bunch of bastard orphans." Chapter 2. Where there were people, there would not necessarily be gangs, but there would definitely be places where people gathered. This was a city. The largest city in Donglin was the capital of Heshi Province. In this city, other than the drunkards that were often seen, the most common people were small businessmen who engaged in illegal trade, the dark figures who vigilantly watched the patrolling police from the shadows, and orphans. Donglin was once the richest and most developed mining planet in the Federation. No matter what kind of civilization it was, the people who engaged in mining always had to take on more risks. Although the invention of the automatic crystal mine tunneling machine and the flawless computer coverage and control ensured the safety of the mining industry to a large extent, the complicated changes in the mineral veins inside the planet, as well as the geological changes that could not be predicted through calculation, still took the lives of many miners in the past thousands of years. The children of these miners became the outliers that wandered the streets of the cities in the eastern forest region. No father, no mother, no father, no mother. Different lives created different mentalities for these orphans. The Federation government fully covered their living and education expenses, but there was no way to prevent these children from playing truant every day. They were not of legal drinking age. Under the surveillance of the chip in their bodies, they could not drink like the miners to pass their days. They also could not engage in the black market trade. Although the government provided them with food, this life of being like a little pig without any light could not completely deplete the vigorous hormones in their bodies. Therefore, violence, imitating coldness, fighting for territory, all of these things came along. The bastard orphans that Deputy Bureau Chief Bao spoke of with a gloomy tone were precisely this group of people. This group of people was an incomparable headache for the governor's office and the police system. Although these young orphans still had a long way to go before they could successfully evolve into a gang, and a simple imitation wouldn't give them too much lethality, the sensitive identity of an orphan was really difficult to deal with. This was especially true after Donglin's mining industry gradually dried up. This group of orphans was basically formed because of the last mining disaster 10 years ago, and the impact that mining disaster had on Donglin. We want to see Jian Shuier. Jian Shui'er. Police sirens kept ringing. Heshi State's second police station, which was responsible for the security of the Zhonglo Street area, received the angry order of the deputy director. They came as fast as they could and isolated more than 100 orphans in the middle of the street. However, in the face of the police with batons and shields, the black-clothed orphans of Clock Tower Street showed no signs of fear. The clamor continued, but the slogans written on the tattered tarpaulin were raised crookedly. Perhaps the children were tired. The funniest thing was that the youngest orphan seemed to be tired of shouting the slogan. He just kept repeating the 3 words, Jian Shui'er, as if these 3 words had some kind of magical power, but they were powerless. Shout more seriously. The leader of the orphans was anxious. She stared with her clear eyes and pulled the little guy's ear. When the police surrounded Zhonglo Street, he felt a trace of fear, but, since Su Lu had said that there were reporters here today, that Bao guy wouldn't dare to do anything. Then, he wouldn't dare to do anything, right? When had Su Lu made the wrong judgment? At the thought of that name, the leader of the orphans immediately straightened his back and gathered his courage. The expression on his face also became more sorrowful and indignant. He shouted at the camera behind the police cordon, "We want to watch Channel 23. The 100 petitioning youths were simultaneously indignant. They were going against the Federation government on the streets just to watch TV. This was such a ridiculous scene. However, Bao Longtao didn't think this was a farce, nor did he think it was ridiculous. Because when he heard the name Jian Shui'er from Channel 23, he knew that this group of wild children was serious today. When the governor's office couldn't resist the wails and hidden threats of several Heshi TV directors, Bao Longtao knew this day would come. In fact, when the governor's office reached the police station under orders and found an excuse to temporarily stop the Federation's Channel 23 signal in the entire Heshi state, the governor's office and the relevant departments of the police station had already received more than 1,000 letters of protest. The contents of these letters of protest were the same as the orphans' demands today. They all wanted to watch Channel 23. They wanted to watch the TV series that had just aired in the capital Ring 2 months ago. Most importantly, they wanted to watch Jian Shui'er. Bao Longtao had watched the TV series called Full Metal Frenzy before, so he also knew how moving Jian Shui'er, who played the role of the captain of the battleship, was. That delicate and cute little face that was like a painting, that head of light purple hair that was sometimes slightly messy and sometimes smooth, that petite body wearing the standard military uniform, and that childish expression when she squinted her eyes and tilted her head. How much did she look like his own daughter, except that she was even cuter than his own daughter? Suddenly, Bao Longtao shuddered and snapped out of his daze. Only then did he notice that the female reporter beside him was talking incessantly into the camera. The camera panned closer and closer to her shoulder, aiming at those indignant orphans. The female reporter's eyes revealed a hint of a gloating smile. The relationship between the news department and the production center had deteriorated to this extent. Bao Longtao sighed gloomily in his heart. In order to protect the viewership of their own station, the senior officers of Heshi TV station did not hesitate to pay such a huge price and use such a ridiculous reason to temporarily suspend the broadcast of Channel 23 of the Federation. Who would have thought that the same TV station, which was directly under the administration of the regional committee, would constantly be thinking of stabbing them in the back? Those who were not from Donglin did not know what television meant to them, and what Channel 23 of the Federation meant to them. Just like Bao Longtao's vicious comment from before, the lives of the ignorant were filled with soap operas. The citizens of Donglin, who were gradually dying and desolate, were already used to the boredom of their own lives. However, that did not stop them from pursuing the beauty of television and imagining the beauty of their lives. And for them, this freedom was an essential part of their lives. It was something they could not do without. Jian Shui'er. The usually cold deputy bureau chief Bao's lips suddenly curled into a warm smile. Even the detestable orphans in the middle of the street did not seem so detestable anymore. However, in the blink of an eye, his smile froze. These detestable orphans had greatly damaged his reputation today. If today's incident was really reported on the news, the conflict between the Ministry of News and the Ministry of Production would definitely reach the governor's office and even the committee. Then, would he become a scapegoat? Bao Longtao narrowed his eyes and slowly slid his gaze across the faces of the excited orphans, as if he was trying to find something. How could these orphans know that he had brought the reporters around today? Why did they make such a fuss? Was it really because of the name Jian Shuier? To these orphans, Jian Shuier was like a little fairy from the distant astral world. However, it was not enough to make these orphans so bold. Things seemed to be a little interesting. He felt that someone was manipulating all of this behind the scenes. If there was really someone behind the orphans, could that person accurately know about the conflict between the Ministry of News and the Ministry of Production and ensure that today's incident would be reported on the news? Bao Longtao became vigilant. His gaze fell on the face of the leader of the orphans, whose face was flushed red. He knew that this 16-year-old wild child was a ruthless character called Vic. However, Vic would definitely not dare to be so arrogant in front of him. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. Following Vic's flickering eyes, he turned his head and looked at a shadow under the clock tower street. However, there was nothing there. Chapter 3. There was no real clock tower on Zhonglo Street, the capital of Heshi Province in Donglin. The reason why this street had such a retro name was because when the federal military first entered Donglin, they made a stupid and heartbreaking gravity measurement error. This was where the battleship crashed. The fireworks from the explosion illuminated the faces of countless soldiers. The commanding officer of the 4th MR sighed. My mood right now is even lonelier than the fireworks. The retro clock carried by the commanding officer of the 4th MR fell out of the damaged battleship along with the beautiful fireworks and smashed into the ground of the mineral planet. The battleship was destroyed, but the stupid clock was not. It was still moving. This was undoubtedly the most merciless mockery of the Federation government and the military. As it turned out, the sigh of the commanding officer of the 4th MR did not have a strong literary tone. The Federation Management Committee was extremely angry about this accident. They were so angry that they carried out a rectification campaign in the military. Many people were removed from their military positions. They also strictly ordered that the walking clock should be placed in its original place as a warning to all public servants. The commanding officer of the 4th MR was sent to the border defense area of the West Woods and lived in loneliness for the rest of his life. Countless years had passed. The stupid clock had long been corroded into pieces by the acid rain. No one knew where it was buried in the garbage dump of Donglin. However, the name of Zhonglo Street remained. There were no fireworks on Zhonglo Street today. It was not lonely either. Instead, it was different from usual. It was full of angry protests that could not help but laugh. Tattered slogans appeared and disappeared in the crowd. The excited residents of Donglin who drank too much coffee joined in. Drunkards who drank too much also joined in. Suddenly, the second police station's power to maintain order seemed to be stretched. The chaotic scene began to develop in the direction of a truly absurd experimental drama. Bao Longtao stood behind the blockade line with a cold face. He was not worried that the residents of Donglin would dare to rush over. Although the residents of Donglin had been bored for a long time and finally found a way to vent their emotions, they were overly excited. Although the blockade line was only a thin yellow tape, the Federation was a society ruled by law. Everyone knew what could be challenged and what could not be challenged. What worried Deputy Director Bao was his previous guess. The appearance of these damned orphans today was too coincidental. The reason they chose to cause trouble was also too cute. Once the media joined in, the governor's office would not be able to do anything to these orphans. Everything, behind the chaos, there was always a hidden order that made him somewhat vigilant. Jian Shui'er. We want to see the Jian Shui'er. The protesting voices continued. The clear and tender voice was already hoarse, but it could not hide the pride and excitement in it. Bao Longtao had already made a decision. He notified the governor's office and asked the higher Federation department to send a negotiation expert. He did not choose a tough confrontation. On one hand, it was because there were reporters present. On the other hand, it was because the state government was indeed in the wrong this time. On the other hand, it was because Bao Longtao's cautious nature began to play a role. It didn't take long for officials from the governor's office, the Federal Radio Regulatory Commission, and the Public Relations Department of the police headquarters to rush to the center of the Zhongluo Street protest. They began to try to convince the residents of Donglin District about this matter. However, no matter what they said, they couldn't explain the fact that the purple-haired figure had disappeared from the TV screen. No one would admit that the stupid decision to protect the production department of the Heshi State TV station was made by them. They would only attribute the problem to technical reasons. In short, the negotiations continued. Under Bao Longtao's gloomy gaze, the orphans quietly disappeared into the crowd. Not long after the leader of the orphans, Wei Gu, led the group of extremely tough orphans into the crowd, the entire Clocktower Street erupted into a burst of joyous cheers. After a round of cheers, the negotiations ended. With a beep, the ultra-thin scroll TV in the coffee shop was turned back on. Clocktower Street was silent. Countless police officers wiped the cold sweat from their foreheads. The female reporter proudly raised the corners of her lips. The officials were cursing the stupid and spineless governor in their hearts. Tonight at 8:00 sharp, Department 23 returned to the capital of Heshi State with the beautiful face of Jian Shui'er. This was really a day of celebration. The night sky of Donglin always seemed strange. The dark gray sky was diffused with a faint dark red light. It looked a bit like the scene of the gates of hell that cultivators would never forget. However, for the people living on this planet, this scene had been seen for countless years. They were already used to it and would never give it a second glance. There were no stars in the sky. Only a few stubbornly twinkled, as if they were unwilling to accept that the starlight that they worked so hard to sprinkle on the land was ignored by the stone-like people of Donglin. Two figures, one big and one small, slipped into the shadows under the street lights. They skillfully avoided the signal detector, passed through an alley beside Clocktower Street, and came to the bottom of a green tree. The green tree was on a small green hill. There were no lights around, and against the distant night sky, it looked like an exquisitely trimmed paper-cut painting. In the middle of the picture, there was a person sitting under the green tree. Judging from the figure, it should be a young man. He sat cross-legged, and the faint glow from the object on his lap outlined his lonely figure. Brother Lu, why is he always alone? Of the two figures who came to the bottom of the green hill, the smaller one spoke slowly, but his voice was still a little hoarse. It was obviously caused by Jian Shui'er, who shouted the slogan thousands of times in the afternoon. The other person was naturally the leader of the orphans, Victor. He looked at the lonely figure of the young man under the green tree and could not help but take a breath and praise. He is really lonelier than fireworks. This sigh of the commander of the 4th Military Region countless years ago had long become a famous saying that the residents of Donglin would never forget. Even an ignorant guy like Victor would use it to describe people. Victor and the little guy ran up the green hill. When they reached the back of the lonely figure, they found that the shoulders of the young man they called Brother Lu suddenly twitched, as if he was crying silently. Victor's face was gloomy. He walked to the front of the young man and asked, "Su Lu, what's wrong?" The lonely young man did not raise his head. He just looked at the portable ultra-thin TV screen on his lap. He looked at the purple-haired girl on the screen, and under the faint light, his face was full of tears. After a long time, the ending melody sounded. The young man named Sulu raised his head, squinted his sincere and honest eyes, and wiped the tears on his face and the saliva on his lips. He said in an unusually serious tone, "Jian Shuier is really too beautiful. In the future, I must marry her." Chapter 4. When the 15-year-old Sulu said this sentence with a trembling voice, a sincere and serious tone, but also extremely panicked, he probably did not think that this sentence had the slightest possibility of being realized. An orphan far away in the remote Donglin district could be infatuated with the purple-haired little goddess of the Federation on the ultra-thin screen on his knees and use this kind of powerful declaration to express the strong emotions in his heart, but in the end, it was just the physiological problems of adolescence that caused the mischief. The poor could have the right to dream and the courage to dream, but the huge gap between the classes could not be closed by individual efforts. What's more, other than being poor, the young Sulu did not have any capital to show. He did not even know if he could go to the capital planet in his life, even if it was just a vacation. The young Sulu was not good-looking, but of course, he was not ugly either. He was just like an ordinary teenager, with a slightly immature and extremely ordinary face. He did not have the appearance of a god, nor did he have the pitiful and cute body of white jade. He was just an ordinary person. The most distinctive feature of his face was his pair of eyes. Under the thick ink-like eyes, they were slightly squinted and looked a little small. It was a pity that his pair of beautiful eyebrows were not there. Especially when he was thinking about something, his eyes would be squinted even more. His originally sincere and simple eyes would reveal a hint of infatuation. Of course, if someone could look into the deepest part of his eyes, they would definitely see a bit of the rock-like determination and certainty that was unique to the people of Donglin district behind the infatuation. From the age of 15 to 50, all the men of the Federation think that Jian Shuier is very beautiful, and they are very willing to marry her as their wife. Under the pale green tree, Vic gently patted Su Li's slightly thin shoulder with his hand and said with great sympathy, "Including me. It's just that I'm thin-skinned and can't say it out loud. You are indeed more shameless." I think so too." The little guy who had been following Brother Wei secretly glanced at Su Lo, only to find that Brother Li's eyes were still fixed on the light of the ultra-thin crystal screen. Then, he mustered up his courage and said, "Brother Lo, don't worry, Brother Lo." Su Lo slowly raised his head, looked at the little guy, and said with a smile, "Changzi, you are only 10 years old. What do you know?" After saying this, Su Lo stood up and leaned back against the trunk of the tree. He gently pressed the ultra-thin crystal screen, and an extremely moving sliding sound could be heard. The entire crystal screen retracted into a thin round shaft. He gently caressed the smooth metal surface of the round shaft. His eyebrows revealed a trace of heartache as he said, "This is a high-quality imitation of an N98. It's worth at least $4,000 on the market. You're lucky. Li Wei, this thing is for you, but if you want to repair it in the future, I'll have to charge you. Don't pretend to be a woman." Li Wei angrily scratched the light blonde curly hair on his head. He snatched the crystal screen and said, "Didn't you see Bao Longtao's face today? More than 100 of us took such a huge risk. Isn't this crappy television worth it?" Su Le chuckled and didn't argue anymore. He patted Li Wei's shoulder and said, "Same old rules. If there is anything in the future, I will come and trouble you." Li Wei didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Su Li's ordinary face with some confusion. After looking for a long time, he couldn't help but ask, "Where have you been for the past 2 years? Why do you always hide from us? I know you don't like us hanging out on the streets and are afraid that we will walk the underworld in the future." But the school has always been open to us. To be honest, in the past 10 years, the government has been good to us. Sulu helplessly sighed and said, "We have lost a lot of homework in school. Who can keep up with it?" Li Wei didn't expect to be able to convince him. He angrily scolded and said, "I'm just afraid that you will become autistic in the future." Hearing this, Sulu laughed until his eyes narrowed, as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. However, he didn't continue the topic. "Aren't you going to try this thing?" It was very clear that the 10-year-old little fellow did not understand the conversation between the two youths. It was clearly a very beautiful, very expensive, and very good round crystal display. Previously, the reception of the television signal under the tree was also very good. What else was there to try? However, after hearing this sentence, Li Wei's face became serious. His right hand held the thin metal shaft and his thumb carefully pushed a small piece of metal that was hard to find. Chi-chi. A strange sound came from under the tree. A faint blue arc of electricity shot out from the front of the thin metal shaft like a beautiful line that could steal one's soul. It ionized the air and circled around the tree for about half a meter before returning to the tip of the shaft. As soon as the blue arc of electricity appeared, the kid was so scared that he immediately squatted on the ground and hugged his head. It was obvious that the orphans on the street had been bullied by this kind of weapon in the past. Li Wei's face was also slightly pale. He looked at Sulu in a daze and asked in a trembling voice, "So powerful. Can this still be called a stun baton? It only looks scary. The impact is less than half of the military standard. The main thing is that it took a lot of effort to modify it." Sulu frowned and said, "This thing can only be used in a fight with the hooligans on the street. If you let the people from the second department see this, it will be terrible." Li Wei hugged the round shaft in his arms and looked at Sulu in disbelief. He said, "I thought it would at most create a spark. You are too damn talented." At this time, Xiao Chang finally got up from the ground. He looked at Su Li's figure under the tree as if he was looking at an angel. Although they were orphans and didn't have much education, they still knew what kind of ability was needed to modify the most beautiful TV screen on the market into such a powerful stun baton. "Hee, I'm a genius." Sulu raised his thick black eyebrows, but he didn't show any sense of frivolity. Instead, he seemed to be very sincere and honest. Li Wei finally looked into his eyes seriously and asked, "Sulu, you must have spent a lot of money to make this thing. Don't tell me, you really did it just to see Jian Shuier." Sulu said in an even more serious tone, "Of course." Li Wei had the urge to hit him, but in the end, he only cursed, "You idiot." Watching the two figures, one big and one small, disappear into the dark night at the edge of the city, Sulu felt relieved. He lifted the hood of his casual shirt and covered his face in the darkness. Only then did he go down the green hill and leave the green tree. Using another road, he headed toward another residential area in the capital of Heshi province. However, the young man's journey home today wasn't smooth. He was stopped under the streetlight at the entrance of Roland Street. "This hood can't cover your face. I think we met 4 years ago." Bao Longtao, the deputy chief of Heshi province's second police station, looked particularly gloomy and scary under the streetlight. He looked at the young man in front of him who was shorter than him by 2 heads and the hood that covered the young man's face and said coldly. Chapter 5. Sulu is willing to meet you because your mother took care of him for 2 years after the mining accident. He's grateful. But you have to know that he's someone who doesn't like to get into trouble. Some words should be left to rot in his stomach. Li Wei, who had already returned to the apartment on Clocktower Street, glared at Xiao Chang. He was a little worried. After all, this little guy was only a 10-year-old child. It would be bad if he accidentally spilled the beans. The little guy pursed his lips, as if he was scared to tears by Li Wei's fierce glare. Although Li Wei's eyes were always so bright and cute, the orphans who lived in Clocktower Street all knew how cruel and merciless the 16-year-old leader could be when he was really angry. The metal shaft in Li Wei's hand was nowhere to be found. At this moment, he was holding a bottle of beer and drinking it into his stomach. He sat under the street lamp and hummed a little tune, looking quite pleased with himself. The little guy looked at him timidly. After a moment of hesitation, he couldn't help but ask, "Brother Le hasn't been back to Clocktower Street for the past 2 years. What has he been doing? Who knows? But this kid has always liked to play with his craftsmanship since he was young. Who would have thought that he would be so ruthless? Do you still remember the incident we saw that year?" Li Wei drank a mouthful of beer and praised. "I was only 5 at that time. I've long forgotten." The little guy licked his lips and looked at the beer in Li Wei's hand curiously. The orphans lived a worry-free life in Donglin District. It was just that it was difficult to find alcohol. The alcohol on the black market was too expensive. "Yeah, I was only 11 at that time, and Su Lo was only 10. Li Wei threw the beer bottle into the garbage pile under the street lamp not far away. He took a deep breath, and the youth's slightly immature face became numb. "If it wasn't for that incident 10 years ago, I'm afraid we would still be in school. Maybe we would have already obtained a professional certificate and gone to Heshi University, or even to the capital planet as exchange students." The street lamp elongated the 2 figures, one big and one small, covering the garbage pile in the distance. A black cat walked through the shadows. Its scattered yellow pupils uneasily discovered that there were no rats today. Everything seemed so lonely and silent. 10 years ago, the mine disaster caused more than 300 miners to be buried underground. The most terrible thing was that the collapse of the mine affected the temporary apartment area. Many family members who went to visit relatives were unfortunately killed, and it was unknown how many families were broken because of it. This incident shocked the entire human society of the Federation. With the advancement of technology, such a tragic death caused countless officials to fall from grace. The officials directly under the capital's Homeland Security Committee, as well as the governor of Heshi State, all resigned under the pressure of the media. 3 officials were sentenced. Even the deputy secretary of Donglin District, who was in charge of security, was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The reaction of the Federation government and the judicial system could not be described as not swift and fierce, but in the end, they were unable to save those lives. This mining accident brought the final heavy blow to the mining industry in the Eastwood region, which was already on the brink of stagnation. The Crystal Mining Alliance Company was thus closed down and handed over to the Federation government to take over. The impact of this incident was quite far-reaching, but very few people thought that for those orphans, the impact of this incident was incomparably huge. The orphans who held a demonstration on Clocktower Street during the day were all victims of the mining accident. Li Wei was one of them, the little fellow was one of them, and Su Lo was one of them. Su Lo was one of these orphans. To be more precise, he was an anomaly among the orphans. During those years, he had never cast any envious glances at the seemingly glamorous gang leaders. He only liked to watch others repair electrical appliances in the grocery store on the corner of the street. He did not appear to be burly or powerful, sinister, ruthless, and callous. On the contrary, he always had a smile on his face. No matter how difficult the situation was, it seemed that he could not be the slightest bit annoyed. But what was very strange was that none of those aggressive orphans dared to provoke him. Vaguely, the orphans on the 3 streets even somewhat respected him. A large part of this respect came from the respect Li Wei had for Su Lo from the bottom of his heart. 5 years ago, due to a coincidental attack by the government, a gang hidden in the shadows was forced to enter the alley behind Clocktower Street that was occupied by the orphans. They used their cold-bloodedness and strength to successfully take over this area that had been abandoned for a long time. In a short 2 hours, 3 of the oldest and most courageous orphans died in this purge. The usually arrogant orphans, before they successfully evolved into those dark forces, were actually just a bunch of little lions with a false appearance. Sulu, who had not participated in any gang activities, disappeared that day. Then, the police force and military support that had been unable to enter the lower district of Hishi capital suddenly entered a large piece of land behind Clock Tower Street through an underground pipeline. Many people died, and the orphans returned to their own places. The 3 dead orphans' deaths were also avenged. But no one knew that on that cold and rainy night, Sulu, who had always been a dull but cheerful person, used an abandoned hydraulic pipe on the elbow of a mecha to kill the last leader of the gang who had escaped. Other than Li Wei and the little fellow who were trembling in the mezzanine of the abandoned factory cafeteria. That year, Li Wei was 11 years old, the little fellow was 5, and Sulu had just turned 10. 4 years ago. Sulu, whose face was hidden in the hood of his coat, repeated the middle-aged man's words. He laughed happily, confirming that the other party was lying to him and not knowing the most terrifying memory in his heart. 4 years ago, I was participating in the school entrance exam organized by the State Education Office. Deputy Bureau Chief Bao looked coldly at the young man in front of him. He knew that the young man was definitely related to the farce that happened this afternoon. However, he could not confirm his judgment. How could a young man know about the internal arrangements of the police station? How could he know about the conflicts between the upper echelons? I need to know who's behind you. Bao Longtao thought that his cold tone was just right, and his question was also very accurate. Of course, he did not think that the orphans in the Clock Tower Street did not know who he was. However, when Sulu heard the question, he could not help but lower his head and smile bitterly. He shrugged, as if he could not see the middle-aged man who was staring at him like a black dog. He walked under the bright streetlights and prepared to go home and sleep. Bao Longtao's hand gripped the baton in his hand. The young man, Sulu, raised a slender and steady finger. He pointed at the dark corner behind the streetlights and said, "There are a total of 5 electronic surveillance cameras here. You belong to the police system, not the judge, and definitely not the management committee. You have no way of deleting the footage, so I advise you not to try to do anything to me. If you have anything to say, please go and get proof. I will cooperate with the investigation." A trace of coldness flashed in Deputy Bureau Chief Bao's eyes, and his body stiffened. After a while, he said, "I want to read your microchip." Sulu turned around, still not taking off his hat, and said sincerely, "The Deputy Bureau Chief of the 2nd Police Station will be scolded by the governor tomorrow. He might even be on the news because of today's demonstration. Who would believe that he would be in the mood to personally check on a harmless young man in the wee hours of the morning?" The hand that had been pointing at the electronic surveillance cameras in the dark slowly shook in the quiet night. Sulu lowered his head and said sincerely, "I'm a good person. Believe me, everything I said was for your sake." Bao Longtao suddenly felt that this unknown young man's calmness and sincerity were somewhat frightening. The suspicion in his eyes grew stronger and stronger, and his grip on the baton tightened. Chapter 6. Bao Longtao hadn't seen clearly what had happened under the tree, but that didn't stop him from being wary of the hooded youth in front of him. He took 2 steps forward, lowered his head, and whispered into Su Li's ear through the hood, "Maybe I shouldn't ask you. I should ask Li Wei." A Federation official dealing with the forces in the dark was like a zookeeper dealing with disobedient animals. Whether it was a whip or fresh meat, there were countless ways to deal with them. Bao Longtao said Li Wei's name as a threat to Sulu. Even if he didn't do it himself, Sulu shouldn't expect to hide his identity. However, Sulu wasn't worried about this. In his opinion, Li Wei and the other orphans had plenty of ways to survive. He discreetly avoided Deputy Director Bao's affectionate behavior, lowered his head, and humbly walked into the darkness. Bao Longtao let go of the baton in his hand and shouted at the youth's back, "If there is a chance, we will meet again." The two met again for a very short time. It was so short that it was hair-raising, so short that it felt absurd. In the darkness of the Green Garden District side entrance, Su Lu raised his head in surprise. His bright eyes narrowed into crescents as he looked at Bao Longtao in disbelief. Bao Longtao was leaning against the wall to show that he had the ability to control everything. Su Lu seemed to be surprised at how this person could follow him to such a remote place without him noticing. "I said we would meet again. And I'm very satisfied that this meeting place doesn't have any surveillance equipment or blind passers-by to disturb our communication." Deputy Director Bao walked out of the darkness in his black police uniform. He had a gloomy and proud smile on his face. He had already pulled out the baton at his waist, and the diamond-shaped metal tip flashed with a frightening blue arc. Although it was weak, it was full of power. Not giving Su Lu a chance to escape, and not letting Su Lu confess ahead of time, Bao Longtao habitually prepared to electrocute this young man to the ground, using the sudden pain to soften his mind and force him to reveal the name of the person behind the scenes who was able to invade the police station's internal program and use Heshi province's upper class to fight. Just as the tip of the baton was about to hit Su Li's waist, Deputy Bureau Chief Bao suddenly felt a sudden pain. A huge electric current instantly occupied his entire body, causing him to convulse in pain and discomfort. He trembled incessantly and collapsed to the ground as if he was having an epileptic seizure. White foam began to form at the corner of his mouth. There was a faint burnt smell in the air, but there were some traces of electric current burning on the wall. After confirming that Bao Longtao no longer had the strength to resist, Su Lu carefully put the stun baton back into his pocket. The stun baton was only the length of a finger, but the electric current it emitted was far more powerful than the one given to Li Wei, not to mention the one in Bao Longtao's hand. Bao Longtao pretended to let him go, but in reality, he wanted to cruelly extort a confession from him in a dark corner. He probably didn't expect that this thin and weak young man would be able to knock him out so easily. Su Lu walked to Bao Longtao's side, squatted down, and checked his condition. He put a metal object into his ear and said in a low voice, "Viewer 78 reports that there has been a change in the situation. Should we silence him?" Su Lu squatted beside Bao Longtao's unconscious body, as if he was waiting for instructions from the other side of the call. After a while, he received the exact order and no longer paid any attention to Deputy Bureau Chief Bao, who was at his feet. He rearranged his clothes, covered his face even more tightly, and disappeared into the darkness beside the Green Garden. Naturally, his residence was not the Green Garden. After a long time, Deputy Bureau Chief Bao slowly opened his eyes. After confirming that the mysterious young man had disappeared, he struggled to sit up. He wiped away the foam at the corner of his mouth and looked in the direction where the young man disappeared with a gloomy expression. The soreness in his muscles and nerves was still there, but it couldn't stop the shock in his heart. After being knocked out by the stun baton, he didn't really lose consciousness. Instead, he heard the young man's last request clearly. He was so frightened by the word silence and viewer that he didn't even dare to open his eyes. Rating surveyor. How could anyone believe that? The Federation television station was controlled by both the management committee and the president. A trace of fear and dread flashed through Bao Longtao's eyes. Could the person who secretly instigated the orphans to cause trouble on the streets be an agent sent by the Capital Star? Especially when Su Lu silently extended the stun baton at the end, Bao Longtao's judgment was strengthened. The stun baton was the length of a finger, but the electric arc could penetrate 50 centimeters of space. Such an exquisite and powerful weapon was definitely not something that could be replicated by gangs. Bao Longtao had only heard that the military was equipped with such a weapon, and it was only used by special agents. Was that young man from the management committee or the president? But no matter which side he was from, he was at an untouchable level. Bao Longtao fearfully supported himself against the wall and crawled up. He knew that he had made a big mistake today, and this matter could never be touched again. Hot water gurgled from the faucet. The Federation television station's welfare had always been good in this aspect. The steaming steam filled the entire bathroom with a hallucinatory smell. Su Lut stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared blankly at his face that was gradually blurred by the steam. He stood there for a long time in a daze before he let out a heavy breath. His hand that was holding onto the white ceramic wash basin seemed to be exerting force in secret. His fingers were pale and trembling slightly because he was very afraid. Su Lut took out the metal object from his ear and the other metal object that was used to change his voice from under his tongue. He threw them above the wash basin, making two crisp sounds. These were two metal buttons on his casual shirt. Su Lut lowered his head and took deep breaths, trying to expel all the fear in his heart. Using two metal buttons to deceive Bao Longtao, who was feared by countless orphans, he did not feel the slightest sense of accomplishment. If not for the fact that he was worried that Bao Longtao would do something to him, he definitely would not have done such a thing. He was not a special agent, nor did he have the slightest relationship with those big shots in the distant capital ring. He was just an ordinary person with some talent in machinery, just a young man. Bao Longtao always thought that there was some kind of power behind him, but only Su Lut himself knew that there was only that damned guy behind him. If not for that guy crying and begging him, he would not have let himself and the orphans fall into such a ridiculous situation. Su Lut did not know if Bao Longtao would continue to investigate. He was not sure if Bao Longtao would continue to investigate. Su Lut used the hot water to vigorously wash his face until his tender face was a little red. Only then did he recover. He stared at himself in the mirror angrily and cursed in a low voice, "Feng Yu, who the hell are you, you bastard?" Chapter 7. Feng Yu was a middle-aged man. In his own words, he was a mature, steady, reliable, and handsome man with a hint of haggard and vicissitudes. He was a peerless middle-aged uncle who could charm all living things in the world, especially young girls. These words were not an exaggeration. If he was willing to bathe more often, shave more of his beard, fix his mouth full of rotten teeth, wear a few suitable clothes, and reduce his age by a few years, perhaps he really would have that kind of charm. Unfortunately, there were not so many hypotheses in the world, so Feng Yu was just an ordinary, childless, middle-aged citizen who only knew how to drink and chat. Every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, he would stay in the electrical repair shop on the 4th Street of Xianglan Avenue and stare blankly, drooling at the uniformed female police officers who occasionally passed by the shop. This electrical repair shop's business had always been good, because Feng Yu's craftsmanship was really good. Whether it was the latest scrollable LCD screen, the antique LCD screen, the overclocked room temperature regulator, or the electric skateboard for children, as long as it was related to machinery and electricity, he could always fix it. The business was good, so naturally, the income was stable. Therefore, during the 3 legal days off every week, Feng Yu would habitually close the shop and then go in and out of the major sanatoriums in Heshi State. He got to know a lot of girls in the sanatoriums and spent a lot of money. The neighbors on the street had long known that this middle-aged man had a lustful side, so they were not surprised. But no one knew that during the weekends for the past 2 years, Feng Yu did not go to vent his lust every time. Instead, he went to a remote mining pit far away from the city. This mining pit had been abandoned for many years, especially after the mining disaster 10 years ago, when the joint company went bankrupt. No one came to this mining pit again. So, when the miners' rest room was turned into a repair shop, no one noticed. Su Lu stared at the middle-aged man on the sofa, sighed, and took out the food from the stove next to him. He put it on the table and said, "Time to eat." As he spoke, he went to get a hot towel and wiped the middle-aged man's face. No matter how troubled Su Lu was, he was always soft-hearted and kind-hearted. Looking at the middle-aged man's dispirited appearance, he couldn't help but want to take care of him. Feng Yu sat on the table and began to chew on the tough meat. Suddenly, he said, "Why is this wild beef getting harder and harder? No matter what kind of meat it is, it will become unpalatable after half a year in the freezer." Su Li's face was expressionless. He scooped a bowl of rice for himself and sat at the table. Their eating habits had become somewhat strange in the past 2 years. In the eyes of ordinary Donglin residents, it was excessively extravagant. "You still haven't answered my question." Su Lu suddenly put down his chopsticks and asked seriously, "I know that you used to be a mechanic in the military, but because you offended your superiors, you became a deserter. But the taser you taught me to make is too similar. Look, it's been a few days, and Bao Longtao is really scared of me. He doesn't even dare to ask who Li Wei is. 2 years ago, I told you that I'm a person with a story." Uncle Feng Yu obviously didn't care about the vomiting effect of his words. He leisurely said, "With my position in the military and the information I had access to at the secret level, let alone a taser, even if it was a standard bore cannon, as long as you have the materials, I can make it for you." Su Lu had heard this kind of talk many times, so naturally he didn't have any reaction. He said helplessly, "Don't brag. Last time, you picked up a mecha central control system with great difficulty in the junkyard. In the end, you looked at it for 5 days and 5 nights, but you didn't dare to repair it." Feng Yu's face turned green. After coughing twice, he reprimanded seriously, "That was an antique from the 4th military region. Who the fuck would look at something from hundreds of years ago? Of course I have to look at it with appreciation. But other than a taser, what else do you know how to do?" Su Lu said dejectedly, "It's been 2 years, and all I've learned from you is how to repair TVs, freezers, toys, cars. In another 2 years, the Ministry of Defense's military recruitment exam will start. I haven't even seen a mecha or a battleship before, so how can I pass?" Feng Yu lowered his head and chewed on his meat. He scolded, "You haven't even finished 12 years of compulsory education, and you didn't even graduate from a military academy. How can you pass? The Ministry of Defense is also recruiting cannon fodder soldiers. Do you want to try? Absolutely every Marine Corps wants you." Su Lu was stunned for a moment, then said very seriously, "Pass the military recruitment exam, and you'll be a mecha repair soldier. You'll have a higher starting point." Feng Yu raised his head and looked at the familiar young man in disbelief. He lamented, "You still haven't given up on your shameful dream? Why is a dream shameful?" Su Li's face showed a trace of persistence. "My first dream in life is to become a battleship auxiliary officer, and my second dream is to enter the research and development department of a large company in the capital ring and live a good life there. The West Woods is still at war with the Empire." Feng Yu's voice suddenly sounded somewhat calm. "Forget your first dream. As for your second dream, it's actually not that difficult." The two of them ate quickly. Su Lu had already started to clean up the dishes, and as he did so, he replied, "After 60 years of war, the people of the East Woods have never seen what the Empire's people look like. Other than seeing their diplomatic mission on TV, what's there to be afraid of?" He suddenly paused for a moment, and said with some frustration, "I know I'm not a genius, and it took me 2 years to learn how to make a taser. But I always feel that I really like dealing with these machines, so I want to try to take the exam." Feng Yu was silent and did not speak. He lay on the sofa and began to watch TV, but his eyes fell on Su Li's back. After washing the dishes, Sulu habitually entered the operation room and began to operate the instruments and tools that he was already familiar with like his fingers. With an extremely steady speed, he repaired the old electrical appliances that were piled up to the side one by one. Those common electrical appliances that were damaged were not difficult to repair. However, Sulu was still very serious in his work, as if he was facing the most sophisticated instruments in the Federation. Perhaps he had never noticed it himself, but every time he was fully immersed in this work, a light called seriousness would appear on his tender face. Uncle Feng Yu lit a cigarette and squinted his eyes through the glass at Su Li's busy figure, thinking that it was time to reduce the dust level in the operation room by another level. Then, he thought of what Su Lu had said before, and couldn't help but slightly curl his lips and blow out a smoke ring. The smoke ring slowly dissipated into Feng Yu's long white hair, disappearing without a trace. Feng Yu thought to himself, everyone in the world calls me a genius, but in fact, in some aspects, this little guy Sulu is more of a genius than me. Chapter 8. After finishing the last micro-welding operation, Sulu took off the dark protective goggles on his face with satisfaction. He sorted all the repaired products in the operation room according to the labels on them and placed them neatly into the metal grid. He pressed a button and moved them out of the operation room. The repaired goods would be sent back to the 4th Street of Xianglan Avenue the next morning. Sulu was always prepared in advance out of habit. After washing his face with hot water, Sulu familiarly took out the liquid medicine from the drawer and carefully dripped it into his eyes. Although they had the help of various observation devices, the world of those metal chips was a kind of torture to the eyes of every mechanic. And when he was focused on the world of the metal chip, he would forget about the existence of time, so his eyes were a little red. Go rest, look at the scenery, and relax the muscles in your eyes. Feng Yu rubbed his white hair and was very satisfied with Su Li's speed and concentration. In the past half a year, the repair shop on Xianglan Avenue was mostly operated by Su Lu in the remote mine pit. Feng Yu only needed to stay in the shop and only give instructions on weekends. Gradually, Su Li's speed became faster and faster. He was even faster than Feng Yu, the mechanic in the army. Su Lu nodded and took out 2 bottles of juice from the ice room on the wall. He followed behind Feng Yu and walked toward the top of the mine pit. Listening to the continuous sounds of metal colliding in front of him, he couldn't help but raise his head. Then, he saw the extremely flashy tattered jeans under the uncle's body, as well as the extremely tight buttocks wrapped in the denim, and the large bunch of keys, 5-star knives, and other metal objects that were constantly swinging in the air. From time to time, they would hit the big buttocks, making annoying sounds. He never understood why Feng Yu wanted to create this image of himself, but Feng Yu told him that the sword in the hands of the swordsman and the gun in the hands of the god of guns never left their bodies. As mechanics, they naturally couldn't let the tools leave their bodies. In fact, Sulu understood that the uncle just felt that the wind chime was very manly and could attract the attention of lonely young women. It was already late, and the light above Donglin gradually dimmed. The red and dark twilight gradually deepened. On the large pile of metal behind Feng Yu, a dazzling light was reflected. Su Li's not very big eyes naturally narrowed. Looking at the back of the figure that was struggling to climb the slope, he couldn't help but remember the time when he foolishly walked into the repair shop 2 years ago. His relationship with Feng Yu was a bit strange. It was not the relationship between student and teacher, but he did learn the knowledge and practical experience about mechanics that he craved most from Feng Yu. Although repairing electrical appliances was of no help to his dream of becoming a warship mechanic support officer or entering the capital ring to seek a better life, at least Su Lu obtained a lot of peace and satisfaction from that small repair shop. Su Lu could not be considered Feng Yu's employee because Feng Yu never gave him a salary. He only left enough food in the freezer. In terms of treatment, the young man could only be considered the most pitiful contract worker in the repair shop on Fragrant Orchid Avenue, but in these 2 years, Sulu did earn a lot of money for the repair shop. If you're a mechanic officer when you sign up for the military recruitment exam, the government will only reimburse you 40%. Sulu looked at the back of the uncle and mustered up his courage to say, "There's only 2 years left. I have to save some money." The subtext of this sentence was naturally that he hoped the repair shop owner would give him a salary. However, Feng Yu didn't even turn his head and directly refused. "You were the one who cried and begged me to teach you. Have I ever thought of charging you tuition fees? What a shameless person, even more shameless than me." Sulu thought in his heart, but when he thought of how shameless he was when he ran into the repair shop and hugged the boss leg without letting go, he didn't have the courage to ask for a salary again. He sighed helplessly, ran forward a few steps, and sat beside Feng Yu. The two of them were sitting at the top of the mine. Behind them was the shadow of a large city building, but because it was so far away, it was particularly blurry. In front of them was a large green grassland. In the depths of the grassland, they could see towering trees. The refreshing scene of nature was currently giving off a feeling of jumping fire under the setting sun. "Actually, I've always been very curious." Feng Yu didn't take the juice that Sulu handed over. Instead, he lit another cigarette and took a deep breath. He greedily looked at the grassland forest in front of him and said, "There are at least 1,000 repair shops in the Donglin district. Why did you choose me?" Sulu looked at him in surprise. He didn't expect that he would only ask this question 2 years later. After a pause, he lowered his head and said, "At that time, the automatic vacuum door in the coffee shop was broken. Later, I heard that you fixed it, so I went to look for you. That door can be fixed by anyone." Feng Yu didn't even turn his head. "Maybe it was because you were too happy when you fixed that door." Sulu smiled, looking particularly sincere. Suddenly, a trace of slyness flashed through his eyes. The glueless vacuum seam of the B2 door was done beautifully. The deviation value was on the level of 1,000 points. This is 2 levels higher than the civilian standard, and even higher than the military standard. From that moment on, I knew that you weren't an ordinary person. Feng Yu was a little surprised. He couldn't help but laugh. He turned around and raised his hand as if he wanted to hit Suli's head. In the end, he just rubbed Suli's messy black hair and said, "You're really crazy. Who would think of measuring that thing? Probably intuition." Sulu laughed happily. "I just felt that there was something strange about that door. At that time, I happened to have some money on hand, so I went to buy a fixed light classifier. After measuring it, I found that something was wrong. Even the smallest classifier wouldn't be able to fit under the door. I'm very curious, how did you measure it?" Feng Yu was obviously interested. Sulu was embarrassed for a moment. After a moment of silence, he said, "I asked Li Wei to help me take down the door of the coffee shop in the middle of the night. Of course, that night, we put it back. I'm not a thief." Feng Yu couldn't help but laugh and asked, "But I installed an anti-theft device on the door, the one hidden in the laminated glass." Sulu lowered his head and answered shamelessly, "I discovered it immediately. I also removed it." Feng Yu suddenly became silent. He quietly looked at the young man beside him and didn't speak for a long time. 2 years ago, Sulu was just a self-taught student who memorized various processes and standards in the library. Unexpectedly, he was able to remove the anti-theft device that he installed himself. It seems that the previous judgment on the sofa was not wrong. At this time, a few majestic bison, cloaked in the light of dusk, slowly wandered out of the forest and headed in the direction of the mine. Sulu and Feng Yu both stopped all thoughts and actions at the same time. They just stared at the bison in a daze. Their eyes emitted a kind of greedy gaze. "Uncle, we haven't eaten fresh beef in half a year." Su swallowed a mouthful of saliva and asked tentatively. Feng Yu stood up and looked at the endless metal isolation net between the abandoned mine and the grassland. His face was abnormally ugly. He said sorrowfully, "In my life, there are two laws in the Federation that I hate the most. One of them is that damned Wildlife Protection Act." Su held back his laughter and asked, "What's the other one?" "The first charter." After saying this most arrogant sentence, he took Su in a fierce manner and walked toward the bison on the other side of the isolation net. Chapter 9. From a certain point of view, the two most stringent laws in the Federation and the most thoroughly enforced laws were the First Charter and the Wildlife Protection Act. They were also the two laws that Feng Yu, the owner of the repair shop, hated the most. The origin of the First Charter had long been unverifiable. Although it touched on the most critical privacy regulations, in the hearts of the Federation citizens, it seemed that they had long been accustomed to its existence. No one had raised the slightest doubt. Perhaps the hundreds of thousands of years of peaceful development of civilization had caused many truths to be buried in the shadows of history. The Wildlife Protection Act was another mystery in the history of the Federation. Many social activists had never understood why the status of wildlife and natural vegetation was so much higher than that of human beings in the Federation. Other than the exploitation of resources, the Federation civilization had very limited modifications to the surface of the planet. It seemed that there was an invisible hand that had been pushing this civilization to try to live more harmoniously with nature. Every planet had an electronic fence that divided the fields outside the city into a large number of areas to protect the wildlife. Any poaching would be met with the most severe punishment by the Federation Management Committee. The problem was that this kind of living was not harmonious, especially for people like Su and Feng Yu who especially liked to eat meat. If they could not eat meat in their mouth, how could they be happy? Although synthetic food could achieve a very rich texture and taste, there were always people in the world who could not erase those instinctive things that were incomparably passionate about natural ingredients. We have to be more careful this time. Half a year ago when we killed that cow, the people of HTD turned the black market upside down, so there was no meat to be sold in the city for 4 days. Fortunately, no one knew that we killed it, otherwise we would have been locked up for 3 months. Su cautiously reminded the owner of the electric fence as he followed the uncle carefully in the direction of the electronic fence. If HTD is really so incorruptible, cough cough. The repair shop owner coughed, indescribably mocking. He threw the cigarette butt to the ground and stamped it out. Where did the rabbit meat and mutton in the black market on Clock Tower Street come from? But what we killed was a wild cow. Su was still a little scared. No one has dared to sell that for many years. We are not selling to the black market. Feng Yu waved his hand and said firmly, even if HTD caught us, at most, they would only give us a reprieve. HTD's full name was National Ocean, Space, and Land Administration. The name sounded scary, but in fact, it was a special agency set up by the Federation government according to the Wildlife Protection Act. Looking at the herd of bison roaming leisurely across the electronic fence, the two of them stopped in their tracks. The buffaloes were not afraid of the humans on the other side of the wall. When they walked, they often saw these poor bipeds, but they had not had close contact with them for many years. But today, the leader of the herd clearly felt the hostility from the two humans opposite it. It raised its huge bull head vigilantly and arrogantly, and the irritation in its eyes grew stronger and stronger. Su was still a little worried, but when he saw the provocative look of the wild cow, he couldn't help but get angry. He thought to himself, I just want to eat your meat. Do you have to look down on me like this? With a few moos, Feng Yu imitated the sound of the wild cow and roared a few times toward the electronic wall. The leader of the herd of wild cows was immediately enraged and rushed toward the electronic wall. Then Feng Yu and Su Lu quickly ran along the wall until they led the wild cow to a small hill far away from the mine. Su Lu ran while gasping for breath. He admired the somewhat clumsy figure in front of him to the extreme. He thought to himself, "Boss is really a wonderful person. He can even provoke a wild cow. No wonder when I first met him, I was so angry that I couldn't even eat." At the bottom of the hill, Feng Yu spat out 2 mouthfuls of saliva and stood on the side of the electronic wall with his hands on his hips. He looked at the exhausted wild cow on the opposite side. He stared at the other side's hooves and 2 sharp horns that were digging in the ground. He gasped and said, "Don't be afraid. These cows have been locked up for hundreds of thousands of years. They have learned long ago. They don't dare to hit this wall." Su Lu held the wall and nodded weakly. The electronic wall on the planet was made of a special kind of steel. It was equipped with a chip management system. Once it was under too much force, it would automatically eject an electric current. God knows how many years had passed, but the electronic wall was not afraid of wind and rain. There was no rust or traces of being hit. One could imagine how strong it was. "Old rules, you kill the cows, I'll keep watch," Uncle Feng Yu said matter-of-factly. Ah. Su Lu had already accepted his fate. He walked to the bottom of the electronic wall dejectedly. He subconsciously touched the chip behind his neck. He wondered if the electronic surveillance network here would notice a small signal jump. After all, he had climbed over the electronic wall 3 times, so Su Lu was not as worried as the average criminal. He took a deep breath and spat 2 mouthfuls of saliva on his palm. He instantly turned into a monkey and used an extremely fast speed and extremely flexible and gentle technique to climb over the wall. Not bad. Feng Yu sat on the hill and smiled as he watched this scene. He thought to himself, if the chief examiner of the National Defense Admissions Examination is not blind, he will definitely be able to see the strength of this young man. And if the people of the Federation knew that someone could directly climb over the electronic wall that was called the Wailing Wall by the black market traffickers without going through the electronic decoding, they would be shocked speechless. The electronic surveillance of the Federation was everywhere. Why was it that when this young man clearly crossed the border, the chip in his neck did not send out a pulse and the surveillance system did not respond? Su Lu did not know that his familiar jump was a destructive step for the First Charter and for the Federation Society. He also did not notice that in the hands of the military deserter and the repair shop owner, there was a small device that continuously emitted a light blue radiance. It completely enveloped the 2 of them and the raging bull. Only when the grassland was large would the bull be able to run happily. Anyone who was locked in an iron cage would feel anger. Or it could be said that when it felt that someone wanted to harm it, it would also feel anger. When Su Li's feet lightly stepped on the grassland, the dark brown raging bull suddenly charged at him. The long hair by its neck fluttered in the air, forming an exceptionally heroic and beautiful line. Su Lu was a bit scared. His face was a bit pale, but he remained calm. When the bull's sharp horns were a meter away from him, he twisted his left ankle and his entire body fell to the side. At the same time, his right hand pointed at the bull's large body. With a zap sound, blue electric arcs flashed. The bull had no way of resisting the inertia. The instant it brushed past Su Lu, it was directly struck by the small but powerful military stun baton. With a boom sound, the bull fell onto the grassland, stirring up some dust and bits of grass. Su Lu walked over. There was not a trace of excitement on his face, only vigilance. Chapter 10. There was a reason for Su Li's caution. In the previous operations, he had confirmed that the stun baton in his hand could completely knock down humans, but he couldn't guarantee that it would be able to capture the powerful bison every time. What happened today also proved this point. When he got close to the black body of the bull, the originally limp bull suddenly exhaled a strong breath. Its four hooves stomped on the ground, and its entire body exploded with a final burst of strength. It was as if it was shaken up from the ground by a huge force and charged towards him. Su Li's pupils shrank slightly, and his face was slightly pale. He seemed to be stupefied. At this moment, he was still holding the stun baton in his hand, but the tip of the stun baton had protruded from the front. It looked like a military knife often used by the army. In the blink of an eye, the fear in the teenager's body was transformed into a powerful force of action through the secretion of hormone in his kidneys. In an extremely dangerous moment, he turned his body sideways. A strong wind blew past his cheeks. He forced his small eyes open and saw every movement of the bison in front of him clearly. Then, he stabbed down with the metal spike that he had been holding tightly in his right hand. Su Li's eyesight was very good, otherwise he wouldn't have such a fast repair speed. Corresponding to this talent, his hand was also very stable, so the slender metal spike didn't deviate in the slightest. The next moment, the military knife was taken away by the huge force. It left his empty hand and remained in the fur 2 inches above the bull's neck, with a few drops of blood. With a boom, the bull that even the stun baton couldn't subdue charged past Su Li's side in an extremely ferocious manner. Then, in an even more resolute manner, it forcefully fell on the slope, causing even more dust and grass to fly up. Su Li held the dagger and foolishly looked at the bull that fell heavily on the ground. He was silent for a long time. His legs stopped trembling, and the healthy red color returned to his cheeks. In that moment, he was really scared because he didn't expect that the bull would have such a strong vitality. Under the effect of the electric current, it could still rush so fiercely. After a long silence, he approached the bison with lingering fear. After confirming that it was dead, he carefully pulled the dagger out from the back of the bull's head. The tip of the military knife had completely destroyed the bull's central nervous system. The bull could no longer jump up to express its anger. Su Li subconsciously narrowed his eyes and glanced at the blood droplets on the tip of the dagger in his hand. The liquid shone faintly in the dusk. He didn't have a trace of excitement after being weakened, and there was no excitement in his heart. There was only a trace of fear and avoidance. Since when can I only use the handle twice? He suddenly turned around and shouted loudly at the shop owner on the other side of the electronic wall. Handle was the name he gave to the electric baton and the dagger. The design of this metal weapon was very delicate, but it was only delicate. After charging, it could only release one current. It was completely incomparable to a real military weapon. Other than the smooth curve of the handle, which made it very comfortable to hold, Su Li didn't find anything that moved him. So he called it the handle. If the taser could release the current twice, it wouldn't have been so dangerous earlier. No wonder Su Li was so rude to the repair teacher and handle designer, Uncle Feng Yu. The handle's design had a flaw. The output current was deliberately increased by 20%, so it could only be used once. Feng Yu, who sat on the other side of the electronic wall, knew all of this very well. He could easily fix this flaw, but he never told Su Li, nor did he complete it. Because he deliberately made such a defensive weapon for Su Li to use. Many years ago, Feng Yu had always believed that if humans relied too much on machinery, it wouldn't be a good thing. It would only block the possibility of human peeking into the body and the universe. Feng Yu didn't plan to discuss these theories with Su Li for the time being, so after hearing the young man's angry question, he just smiled and didn't answer. Instead, he took out the flat pack of cigarettes from his jeans, lit one, and smoked happily. Su Li turned his head dejectedly and lowered his body. Looking at the busy young man on the other side of the wall under the twilight, Feng Yu's heart was touched. In fact, he was a very cold person. Otherwise, he wouldn't have escaped to such a remote place like Donglin district. However, the warm light of the grassland and the dark night behind him intersected. Under the red sunset, the young man was peeling the cowhide and cutting the beef. From time to time, he would wipe the blood on his hands on his clothes. This was a very bloody scene, but it was also a scene full of the beauty of life. All life in the world flowed between life and death. Feng Yu held the cigarette in a daze. Looking at the young man wielding the knife and dancing, he couldn't help but think of a scene in the classic literature he had read many years ago. In the autumn harvest, the farmers harvested the crops and used the remains of the plants in exchange for their own survival. Beside the tribe's campfire, the men and women drank wine and ate the animal parts roasted in the fire. It was very happy. A trace of a smile floated on Feng Yu's cheeks. This emotional smile, together with his white hair, seemed to reveal his true age. A sense of vicissitudes began to leak out. He had always felt that Su Lu was a very interesting child because this child always seemed to focus his energy on those two ideals and didn't notice his ability in other aspects. For example, in the moment when the wild bull was slaughtered, other than people who had received special training in the military, who could kill the bull with just a dagger. Why was there very little wild bull sold in the black market these past few years? Feng Yu thought of Su Li's previous question, and the smile on his face couldn't help but become wider. In the context of the Federation government's strict gun control, who would dare to risk their lives to hunt a bull? This child is really stupid in some aspects. Didn't he realize that when he was leading the bull, he and I could run faster than the angry bull? Didn't he feel that being able to kill a bull with his bare hands was more worthy of pride than fixing a TV? Motherfucker, motherfucker. Under the twilight, Su Lu cursed as he endured the discomfort and continued to butcher. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore. He stood up and shouted at the shameless middle-aged man who was smoking, "No more bones, there are still 200 pounds left. If you continue to be lazy, when can we have dinner tonight?" Su Li's various talents in all aspects were actually nothing in Feng Yu's eyes. This was because in his long life, he had seen who knows how many true geniuses. But when he killed the wild bull, Su Lu showed a calmness that was completely inconsistent with his age. Although his legs were trembling in fear and his face was pale, he was still calm and composed. This was what Feng Yu admired most about him. At the same time, this was also what Feng Yu thought was the most boring part of the teenager. So at this moment, when he heard Su Lu curse, he was actually somewhat happy. He laughed like a wild white flower, stood up, and patted his butt. Chapter 11. After the bloody beef was fried in the pan, sprinkled with pepper and all kinds of seasonings, it began to emit a rich fragrance of the ingredient itself. The silver table knife cut through the slightly brittle surface of the meat. It was different from the scene where blood spurted out when the handle pierced through the bison's head. Although there was some blood on this piece of beef, there was more of the juices that made one want to eat it. The ordinary citizens of the Federation who ate synthetic food all year round had no resistance to this kind of natural food, let alone the shop owner and the young Su Lu who loved meat like it was their life. After a wonderful dinner, Su Lu cleaned up the bowls and chopsticks and hid the rest of the beef and innards in the huge freezer in the operation room next to the mine. He found that he had obtained a rare moment of leisure, and for a moment, he didn't know what to do. After standing in the room for a while in a daze, Su Lu took out a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses from the drawer and went out the door. Along the broken steel ladder, he climbed to the grass above the mine. The shop owner, Feng Yu, had been in a daze for a long time. He had been watching the last ray of light disappear between heaven and earth, and then it was completely covered by the most complete darkness. Taking the glass of red wine from behind him, Feng Yu took a sip and said with a smile that wasn't a smile, "Using my baby to please me, what do you want to ask?" Su Lu carried the wine bottle to his side and followed the uncle's gaze to the grassland in the distance. At this time, the night was already deep, and he didn't know how spectacular the sunset would be. He knew that the shop owner must be hiding a lot of things from him, but he didn't want to ask because he only followed Feng Yu because he wanted to learn about mechanics from him, and not because he wanted to hear a touching story. Besides, everyone had their own secrets, and they didn't want to be disturbed. "Actually, I'm not an idiot." Su Lu suddenly opened his mouth. He did not deliberately act like he was in a difficult position, but he habitually stopped the car in front of an important word and emphasized his tone. Ever since his parents and sister died in the mining accident 10 years ago, Su Li's lonely life seemed to have lost its focus. Therefore, when he occasionally came, he would only use this kind of clumsy method to express his emotions. The young man narrowed his eyes in the darkness, appearing somewhat cautious. In fact, he had already guessed something. In the past 2 years of working with Feng Yu, other than the knowledge and practical skills of the mechanical repair methods, the ugly postures that the boss made him take and some of the daily exercises were very strange. Su Lu was honest and sincere, but that didn't mean that he was brainless. It was just that he always thought that those postures and gymnastics were probably military training techniques, so he always played dumb. Perhaps it could make his body stronger. Since the boss wanted him to learn something that was beneficial to him, he would learn it. However, after killing that wild bull today, he felt a chill in his heart. His boss was just a mechanic who escaped from the army. Why did the things he taught him have such great power? Could it be that what he usually taught her was the legendary killing technique that the military had never taught to outsiders? "I've never thought of you as an idiot. On the contrary, I think of you as a genius." Feng Yu removed the cup from his lips. His expression was calm, but there was a trace of a strange smile in the wrinkles at the corners of his brows. "I'm not a genius either. I just don't understand. What's the use of you teaching me these things?" Su Lu looked somewhat helplessly into Feng Yu's eyes and asked, "The Department of Defense's Mechanical Repair Officer exam doesn't test field combat ability at all. I don't want to waste time on these things." Su Li's voice began to tremble, as if he was enduring some kind of intolerable pain and suffering. Feng Yu couldn't even be bothered to look at him. He calmly said, "With your personality, since you've asked, it seems like you really are conflicted about this matter. I just don't understand where your conflict is coming from." Su Li's voice was still trembling, and the sound of heavy breathing could be heard from time to time. He said angrily, "This is already the 63rd year of the 37th constitutional calendar. Human civilization has already developed to this stage today. What's the use of you making me learn these things? No matter how strong a person is, can he contend against mecha head-on? Can he fly into space and fight against battleships? I understand. You want to become a mechanic who can repair the 3 major systems of mecha and battleships. So, in your eyes, those cold metal machines are naturally much stronger than the ant-like individual humans." Feng Yu replied coldly, "But don't forget, no matter how developed humans are, they are still biological humans in the end. You're still in this shell. This shell is your final life-saving measure. It's the first-order machine you must know like the back of your hand and operate without hindrance. As for mecha and battleships, those are just more extrinsic things." Feng Yu slowly closed his eyes. A person can't hide in a mecha forever. You need to eat, sleep, go to the toilet, have sex, have orgasms, shower. A person's time without clothes takes up 1/10 of their life, then what about the time you don't wear a mecha? Su Lu was dumbfounded. He felt that his boss's words made no sense, but there was also a strange charm to them that could not be broken through by twisted logic. Feng Yu downed the remaining wine in his glass in one gulp, and then suddenly lowered his head and laughed. Besides, the Federation is currently lacking in energy. Who knows when space battleships will become trash in the universe? Mecha don't need crystal ores. The current high-energy compressed energy is enough to support Mecha's movements on land. Sulu knew that his boss was only saying so much today to convince him, but he still stubbornly retorted, besides, what life-saving? What last shell? It's not like I'm going to the West Woods to fight the Empire's barbarians. I just want to be a mechanic to earn money, and at the same time do what I like. Why should I care so much? Let's not talk about your future, because in my opinion, you might not be able to pass the Ministry of Defense's exam. Who knows, you might have to work for me for free for the rest of your life. Feng Yu laughed, and then his laughter gradually faded. Think about the people on the 3 planets in Xianglin. Think about those families that have been around for thousands of years, and even those 7 great families. Why do they always respect that old man and his students so much? Why? Isn't it because of that old man's own strength? Xianglin was the name of the capital ring. The capital ring was made up of 3 habitable planets. It was the most developed, wealthiest, and most comfortable place in the entire Federation civilization. The so-called 7 great families, to the young Sulu who lived in Donglin, were ancient, upper-class existences that were far beyond his reach. And that old man that Feng Yu was talking about, oh my god, you're calling the war god the old man. Su Li's voice was extremely trembling. It was unknown whether it was because of pain or fear. Alright, you don't have to do the horse stance today. Do the gymnastics again. Feng Yu did not answer Su Li's shocked words. He smiled as he looked at Su Lo, who had already maintained the standard horse stance for half an hour. He thought to himself, although this kid is naturally resistant to these things, he is exceptionally serious when he does things. Other than him, which teenager can endure the horse stance test day after day for 2 years? Pay attention to your breathing. Relax your mind. Feng Yu stood up and looked calmly and sternly at Su Lo, who was paralyzed on the ground. He said word by word, feel and remember the most painful trembling path in your muscles. Don't forget it. Chapter 12. Standing on the slope of the mine pit, facing the quiet night sky of the west, with the dark red city of beasts behind him, the stars in the sky of the Donglin region were so dim, as if there were endless layers of gauze shrouding the highest part of the atmosphere. In such an environment where the light was dim and changing, Su Li's blurry figure was constantly twisting and stretching. According to certain routines, he stuck out his foot, twisted his waist, lowered his body, threw a punch, turned his wrist, and extended his elbow. Feng Yu watched calmly from the side, not saying a word. It had been more than a year, and the teenager had already memorized this set of movements. There was not the slightest mistake. Even the angle of the diagonal dragging of his fingertips was not off by a bit. This set of movements that did not seem complicated could not be considered gymnastics because the routines were a bit scattered, and the movements were too slow. It was more like a dance. The problem was that compared to the famous performers of the Xianglin song and dance troupe, this dance was too stiff. It wasn't raw, but raw. Su Li's movements had a bloody feel to them, as if they hadn't been roasted by fire at all. It was hard to chew on the muscles and bones. It was not stiff, but it was the reinforced plexiglass used in the operation room to bear the blade. It was also like the endless stones under the Donglin planet's grass. It was blindly hard, and every movement was so clean and neat. This stiff dance was broken down into roughly 10 movements, and every 2 movements were taken in opposite directions. In the end, Sulu seriously retracted his right foot and squatted in a strange position. Only then did this set of movements completely end. It did not seem complicated, and the amount of movement was not that big, but Su Li's face was covered with a layer of hot steam. Under the night sky of the Donglin region, he exuded a red glow. Sweat soaked his back and dripped down the corner of his tight vest. It was obvious that such a short time of movement had cost him a lot of energy. Sulu breathed slowly, and for a long time, he could not speak. The youth's originally thin body seemed to be filled with a hidden strength at this moment. The lines of his body were very beautiful. Who knew what this body would look like in a few years' time when he fully became an adult? The reason he remained silent was not only because he was tired, but also because the 600 muscles in his body were completely occupied by soreness. Sulu did not even want to move a finger. At this moment, every muscle fiber seemed to be breathing, expanding, and rubbing against each other. Like the friction between metal and porcelain, it was extremely painful and bitter. After the sourness, there was a burst of completely spontaneous trembling that seemed to rise from the depths of Su Li's heart. It followed the path formed by the muscles, nerves, and connective tissues, and spread out in all directions. It was like the beating of a drum, shaking every tiny part of his body, causing small protrusions to appear on his exposed skin. Then, they disappeared, as if there was an invisible force that was sliding on his skin. His trousers began to tremble in the windless night, covering the fact that his legs were trembling non-stop. Sulu understood why the silk muscles would heat up on their own, creating the illusion of friction. He did not know that it was because the muscle fibers of the human body were originally made up of two filamentous proteins that were entangled together. Of course, he did not know why these muscles were trembling, what they meant, and what they were used for. He only firmly remembered the words of the repair shop owner. He had to remember the pain in his heart, and he had to remember the path of soreness and trembling. After changing out of the sweaty clothes and taking a shower, the refreshed Sulu once again climbed to the top of the mine with his head hanging down. He sat beside Feng Yu weakly. His face was somewhat pale, as if he was seriously ill. Feng Yu did not pay attention to him. He just casually looked at the crystal screen on his knees. The faint blue light on his face made the repair shop owner's face look somewhat cold and feminine. It's impossible to confirm whether or not Bao Longtao recognized me on the internet, Su said somewhat tiredly. With just a glance, the familiar light blue interface let the youth know that the boss had secretly hacked into the Federation's police system again today. Last time, when he asked Li Wei and the group of orphans for help on Clock Tower Street, it was precisely because of these two people above the mine that they had already thoroughly investigated the inside story of the governor's office and the police station. Someone who could hack into the official internet was certainly not a simple person. It was just that this seemingly ordinary repair shop owner had occasionally brought such surprises to Su in the past 2 years, so he was not too surprised. After all, it was not a surprise. Sometimes, Sulu would also wonder what kind of mistake the boss had made in the army that caused such a talented person like him to become a deserter. In the past 2 years, he had always had a kind of unreal feeling. He always felt that he had met an awesome person hidden in the marketplace. It was too much like a scene from a movie or TV series. It was really unbelievable. The youth did not want to inquire about the boss' past. On one hand, it was because he really was not interested. He only wanted to learn about mechanical repair. On the other hand, he was sometimes vigilant and afraid of Uncle Feng Yu's mysteriousness. He always felt that he had mistakenly entered a thief's lair. On the other hand, it was because Sulu was very good at reading people. Other than the calmness that Feng Yu admired the most, the life of an orphan allowed Sulu to develop the ability to observe people's body language. He knew that although the repair shop owner next to him looked harmless, in fact, there was a coldness hidden in his bones that could not be erased. In other words, Sulu knew that Uncle Feng Yu was a heartless and cold-blooded person. He did not want to risk his life. The news department and the production department of the Heshi region TV station are fighting. It seems that the people behind the regional committee and the governor will also be fighting. Feng Yu looked at the words and images that flashed on the crystal screen and said with a smile, "At this time, Bao Longtao can't even take care of himself. How could he associate it with an orphan like you?" If an ordinary person heard this conversation between the two, they would most likely think that the two people in the repair shop promoting the Clock Tower Street demonstration was hiding a great political conspiracy. However, Su Le knew that the middle-aged man next to him had no interest in these matters of the upper class. Moreover, they were just small figures. They could fan the flames, but to really come into contact with these matters was to seek death. The familiar music sounded, and the familiar face of the purple-haired girl appeared on the crystal screen. The middle-aged man and the youth sitting on the hillside simultaneously stopped talking and began the most important leisure activity every night. It was accompanied by waves of saliva swallowing and praising sounds. Under the extremely faint red background of the night sky, the invisible electric waves, signals, and radio frequency were constantly crossing each other. The invisible lines eventually turned into colorful images that entered the eyes of countless people in the Donglin region, enriching their dreams. A dark red line streaked across the night sky with a faint roar breaking through the air. It was probably the military patrolling the sky with fewer and fewer people. A few wild black cats were drilling in and out of the natural rock tunnel under the electronic wall. They ignored the first charter of human beings and gathered in the direction of the abandoned mine, happily searching for the food residue left behind by the two humans. A stray cat with a few pieces of beef in its mouth raised its head in confusion and looked at the two figures above the mine pit who were together but still alone. In another corner of the city, a group of orphans who were together but still alone were silently and murderously walking on the road of chopping people. The leader, Li Wei, had his hand in his pocket, tightly holding the metal stick that gave him strong confidence. Chapter 13. A month had passed, and according to the people of Shanglin in the Federation's capital ring, it should be late autumn now. In those novels, late autumn had cold winds, drizzling rain, and a clear sky. However, for the people of Donglin, the 4 seasons of this world were not very clear. Perhaps it was the dust above the atmosphere that would never be completely clear, turning the entire planet into a strange glass room. The so-called late autumn was just an extra layer of clothing. Su Lo wore a navy blue jacket today. The style was somewhat like a uniform, and it added some youthful vigor to his ordinary face. He was currently sitting outside the window of a repair shop on Fragrant Orchid Street, seemingly unintentionally, but actually vigilantly observing the situation across the street. At the diagonal corner of 4th Street was the building of Hishi Region's 2nd Police Station. A middle-aged man in a trench coat walked down the slightly damp steps with waning interest and got into a car. The police officers around the car saluted him, but there was some sympathy in their eyes. Seeing this, Su Li's mood relaxed a little. He had been watching Bao Longtao for a month, and it looked like this deputy director was really frightened by his identity as a Federation agent. He no longer dared to investigate the Zhonglo Street demonstration, and even Li Wei's group of orphans were not suppressed. Su Lu had a calmness that was beyond his age, and he had an innate sensitivity to certain things. He would never foolishly use another identity to get close to Bao Longtao just to see if he had recognized him. He also would not relax his observation of Deputy Director Bao just because he appeared calm on the surface. He only watched calmly with excellent patience until everything really calmed down. Although he and the repair shop owner were both fanatical supporters of Jian Shuier, it was really not in line with his character to take such a big risk just to watch television. If the shop owner had not tempted him with the operation room, he would have at most sighed a few times about the incident at Channel 23, and then went to buy a few more discs of Jian Shuier. He was a little scared. Once he thought about going against the governor's office, Su Lo could not suppress his fear. Especially when he thought of that night when he was stared at by Bao Longtao, his thighs couldn't help but twitch twice. This was a natural reaction when he was scared to a certain extent. That night, if he hadn't been quick-witted enough to use 2 buttons to pretend to be a communication tool and the military standard taser to scare Bao Long Tao, he really wouldn't have known how to deal with this matter. The finger that was pointing at the electronic monitor in the night wind seemed stable and arrogant, but in fact, it was incomparably terrifying. Pretending to be an agent of the Federation. When he thought of this, Su Li's expression turned ugly. He lowered his head and muttered to himself, "I don't like to act cool. I just want to be a good person. It's much harder to be a good guy than to act cool." Boss Feng Yu had just returned from the leisure center. He brushed past Su Lu like a gust of wind and went upstairs to rest that in the past 2 years, Su Lu did not appear at the repair shop on Fragrant Orchid Street. He only did repairs in the operation room of the mine. Therefore, in the eyes of orphans like Li Wei, he was equivalent to a person who disappeared from the city for 2 years. Until 1 month ago, Su Lu completed that task for Feng Yu. Feng Yu promised him to upgrade the operation room's dustless level. However, this uncle was lazy again, so he simply brought Su Lu back to the repair shop and officially introduced the existence of this young apprentice to the neighbors of the 4th Street. Since the boss was back, Su Lu no longer had to keep an eye on the shop. After all, the shop's business was limited no matter how good it was. Although the residents of the 4th Street knew about the craftsmanship of Feng Yu and his little apprentice, no one could withstand the speed at which Feng Yu fixed a TV screen for 3 months. After tightening the buttons on his student uniform, Su Lu yelled something upstairs, walked out of the shop, and boarded the streetcar at the end of the street. Hundreds of years ago, after the invention of the Jingnong high-energy battery, both trolley and trackless buses broke free from the constraints of the 2 braids on the top of their heads and began to travel freely in the city. Of course, normal people would definitely have their own means of transportation, and the rich people on the 3 planets in the upper forest area already had their own means of transportation. Only the poor, or those who were full of nostalgia, would continue to ride the streetcar. Su Lu had both advantages and disadvantages, so he was naturally a long-term passenger of the streetcar. He leaned against the door and stared at the city buildings that flashed by in front of him. He could not help but feel regretful that he could no longer hear the clanking sounds in the literature. The streetcar's final stop was Heshi State University in the eastern forest area. After Su Lu got off the streetcar, he did not cast an envious look at the beautiful campus environment. Instead, he walked along the school wall, passed through a large tree, and entered the library. He had not gone to school for a long time, but he had to read. Firstly, this was Feng Yu's request for him, and secondly, it was his own desire. Other than most of the mechanical books and the Federation standards and regulations, he liked to read all kinds of novels the most. Especially after he got a library card at the State University, he would come here every day. It was as if there were endless beauties in these books, and an endless glorious future waiting for him. There were no fortuitous encounters in the library, nor were there any beauties. Su Lu carried a large pile of books out of the library, and there was not the slightest bit of dejection on his face. Then, he saw an unexpected person in front of the gate of the State University. Li Wei, who had not seen him for a month, appeared in front of Su Lu just like that. Looking at the somewhat haggard and tired face of the orphan leader, Su Lu suddenly felt his lips dry up. He did not know what happened, so he asked in a hoarse voice, "Don't tell me you still have the ambition to enroll in a university." "I only have the ambition to occupy the night of the entire Heshi state." Li Wei's voice was a little hoarse, but his expression was not that nervous, so Su Li's heart relaxed a little. "The thing you gave me was confiscated by the people from the 2nd Division. But don't worry, no one knows it's mine." Li Wei licked his dry lips. After fighting with another gang for an entire night, he was indeed a little tired. Su Li's eyes lit up, not because of excitement, but because of nervousness. His thighs started to twitch uncontrollably, and he felt the books in his arms become heavier and heavier. Chapter 14. How did you know I was at the State University? Su-Lu lowered his head and asked. Li Wei did not notice his partner's heavy mood. He smiled and said, many people know that you've entered the repair shop. I thought that although there wouldn't be any trouble, it was something you worked hard to make, so I had to let you know. No trouble. Is that true? Su-Lu asked himself in his heart, but he could not find an answer. The stun baton was made with military technology. If the police really wanted to investigate, would they find out that he was the culprit? Would they find out that he was a deserter? He should be angry at Li Wei for losing the stun baton because he had repeatedly told him to do so. However, looking at Li Wei's satisfied and tired face, Su Li's heart softened and he did not say anything. He heard that Li Wei's group of orphans had been fighting for territory for the past month. They were probably tired. There should be a lot of weapons in the black market from the military. The stun baton was hidden in the crystal scroll. Although it was ingenious, it should not attract too much attention. Su-Lu comforted himself in his heart. He patted Li Wei's shoulder and said seriously, just pretend that you never saw that thing, but I'll say it again. Don't always think about fighting and killing. You still need to find a proper job in the future. What proper jobs are there in Donglin now? Didn't you see what the students were arguing about in the streets today? The unemployment rate is already 30%, and that's not including the seniors who took care of after the Crystal Mining Union went bankrupt. Li Wei touched his curly blonde hair and said stubbornly, I want to stand out. I don't want to live on welfare for the rest of my life. Demonstration. Su-Lu was taken aback. There were very few people in the Donglin district who were interested in politics. The incident at Zhonglo Street was already considered a big event. How could there be students who didn't study hard but wanted to march? A lot of people went to watch the show. I heard that it was organized by the Veteran Association. Li Wei took the heavy book from his hands and walked towards the street while explaining, I heard that there was a problem with the election in the capital ring. The opposition parties felt that it was unfair and organized a demonstration across the federation. Oh. Su-Lu was very worried at this time, so he answered casually. He, Li Wei, and the other orphans knew nothing about politics, so they kept a respectful distance from it. They did not want to touch it, nor were they interested in it. Although there was indeed unfairness in the Federation society, for example, the upper class led by the 7 great families always had a better life than the common people. The dark oppression was always hidden under the bright cloak of law and justice, but what did this have to do with them? They had grown up in an unfair environment, so they were already used to it. It was hard for them to be hot-blooded. Back at the repair shop on the 4th Street of Xianglan Avenue, Su-Lu hesitantly told his boss, Feng Yu, about the police intercepting the taser batons. To his surprise, Uncle Feng Yu was not worried at all. He seemed to think that his identity as a military mechanic who defected would never be exposed. In fact, this was indeed the case. In the next 10 days or so, other than the shock of the Federation's demonstration, nothing new happened in the Donglin district. The use of military weapons in gang fights was just a small matter that could happen anytime and anywhere in the Federation society. No big shot would have the time to cast their eyes on this small repair shop. However, Su-Lu was still cautious. He always felt that there was an uneasy feeling. He always felt that the taser batons that had fallen into the hands of the police would bring him some kind of trouble, but he did not know whether this trouble was big or small. Therefore, he began to actively strengthen his practice of that set of movements. He often returned to the mine to accompany the stray cats and kept performing the stiff dance. One day, Feng Yu looked at him, who was sweating profusely, and said sarcastically, "Didn't you always think that individual strength is useless in front of metal machinery?" Su closed his eyes and felt the trembling of every muscle in his body, as well as the trend of the trembling becoming more and more obvious. He tried to find the true effect of this trembling. With a trembling voice, he gritted his teeth and said, "Until now, I haven't changed my mind. But the problem is that if the police really come to arrest us, you don't have the money to buy me a mecha. Of course, even if you did, I wouldn't use it. Other than making myself stronger, what else can I do?" "You're still worried about that taser baton?" Feng Yu frowned. He did not understand why this child was so cautious. He suddenly smiled and said, "Don't forget about the chip behind your neck. Under the light of the first charter, if the police really want to arrest you, where can you run to? Could you go to Bermuda as a refugee, or go to the Empire as a traitor?" The electronic surveillance network spread throughout the entire Federation society. In theory, it could control the occurrence of all criminal activities. Su did not panic when he heard this. He said seriously, "The gang is still here. You, a fugitive from the military, are still alive and well. I believe that you will definitely have a way." What a bold claim. If there is anyone in this world who can remove the chip in their body without alerting the Federation surveillance network, then they will definitely win the Nebula Award. Feng Yu's smile was somewhat mocking. "You just celebrated your 16th birthday last week. How can you be more cautious than an old man like me? It's really ridiculous." Su retorted sarcastically, "Don't forget your mouth full of rotten teeth. In order to get a new dental record and not be arrested by the government and the military, you paid such a heavy price, and you still have the nerve to mock me for being cautious." Feng Yu helplessly shook his head and did not refute. The days were peaceful. Even Su was beginning to think that he was too timid. The two people in the repair shop did not know that in this city, there was another person who was in the same predicament as them. This person was the deputy chief of the second police station, Bao Longtao. Ever since he embarrassed the governor's office a few months ago, his influence in the police station had been greatly weakened. "I actually need to write a report to get a piece of evidence, and this report actually needs 2 months to be approved." Deputy Chief Bao looked at the metal shaft in the vacuum bag on the table and laughed self-deprecatingly. With his position, if it was in the past, he would not have needed to go through so much trouble. Thinking of this, his hatred for the orphans in his heart grew even stronger. If it were not for the incident at Clock Tower Street, his request for a transfer would have been approved a long time ago, and the families in the capital ring would not have ignored him for so long. However, during these days, he did not dare to take revenge on the orphans because he was not sure if the face covered by the hat that night was a Real Federation agent. Wearing gloves, he took out the metal shaft from the bag. Squinting his eyes, Deputy Chief Bao looked at the exquisite electric current generator inside and secretly wondered if this had anything to do with the stun baton that Federation agent was holding. Although there were many military weapons like this on the black market, they were all extremely expensive. Those orphans should not have the financial resources to buy them. After thinking in silence for a long time, Deputy Chief Bao decided to investigate this matter. Of course, he did not dare to investigate it himself. Instead, he focused on the stun baton. He wanted to confirm if there was really a Federation agent in Heshi province. Deputy Chief Bao had a few comrades in the research institute in the capital ring who should be able to help. After filling in the address on the envelope of the official email, Deputy Chief Bao ordered his secretary to take the evidence out and send it to the identification department of the 17th Research Institute in Shanglin District. This deputy chief who had lost his power instinctively wanted to find out the truth of this matter, but he did not expect that this small action of his would have such a huge impact on the future of the Federation. Chapter 15. Human civilization, regardless of the time period, space, or whether there were historical records, as long as the structure of society was initially established, it would inevitably fall into layers of bureaucratic encirclement. The Federation, which had more than a dozen habitable planets and a large number of resource planets, was no exception. Due to the large population and the expansion of the territory into space, this bureaucratic encirclement appeared to be even thicker. An official mail package from the second police station in the capital of Heartfelt State in the Eastwood region embarked on its long journey under the encirclement of bureaucratic encirclement. Oh right, before it departed, it was stamped by 3 departments in Heartfelt State and went back and forth twice between the aviation department and the logistics department before it boarded the spaceship to the capital ring. 3 months later, this official mail package arrived at the administrative planet of the capital ring, which was also the place the Federation people called Xianglin. It lay quietly in a clean and tidy box, sitting silently in the corner of the car. After leaving the airport, it traveled all the way through the express highway between the green forest and beautiful buildings. After 4 hours, it arrived at a government agency outside the capital. The Information Receiving Department of the 17th Research Institute of the Federation signed the receipt, then categorized the package and put it on an automatic document transmission belt. Accompanied by the slight sound of the machine, the package numbly passed through the passage between the walls and entered a well-lit office. A deputy director of the department saw the package on the table. He pushed his glasses up curiously and looked at the unfamiliar address on the package. He frowned for a long time before he remembered that this somewhat familiar handwriting was written by a distant comrade. Old Bao has been in that godforsaken place for more than a decade. I'm afraid he has become muddle-headed. The deputy director thought in his heart. He received an email from Deputy Director Bao 3 months ago, but now he had forgotten the seriousness of the other party's request. Why does the police station need the research institute to verify the evidence? How much does it cost to send it from Eastwood? This kid is not afraid that the committee will say that we are wasting the taxpayers' wealth. The deputy director shook his head with a headache and pressed the communication device on the desk. A researcher wearing silver glasses walked in. His hair was white, and it seemed that he had been in the 17th Research Institute for a long time. The middle-aged researcher looked at the deputy director and asked, "Director, what's the matter?" Here is a piece of evidence sent by the Donglin Police Headquarters. The request for identification is also in the package. Take it to the lab and have a look, the deputy director said casually. The middle-aged researcher glanced at the official mail package and found that the signature was not from the Donglin Police Headquarters, but from the second police station of Heartfelt State. He immediately understood. According to the level of the police station in the state, it was very difficult to be qualified to apply for the appraisal of the 17th Research Institute. It seemed that the deputy director had accepted the personal request, but since the other party had used official channels, it was naturally not convenient for him to ask more. Which aspects do you want to appraise? The middle-aged researcher took off the glasses on the bridge of his nose and looked at the package carefully. He asked, "Is there a time limit?" "No." The deputy director waved his hand and recalled the contents of the email. He said, "The main thing is to compare the craftsmanship and see if it has anything to do with the special task force or the military. The villagers in Donglin are very worried that this thing came from the military." The middle-aged researcher smiled and did not say anything. He turned and left the room. The next day, he returned to the office and reported the results of the previous day's appraisal to the director. There is no code in the core material, so it shouldn't have come from the military. However, the craftsmanship does have something to do with the military. I think it's a replica made in Bermuda. The director asked. There's nothing strange, right? No. Just like that, Deputy Director Bao completed the appraisal request reluctantly. After receiving the official reply from the 17th Research Institute, the deputy director still could not confirm whether the figure in the night was a Federation agent. The metal stun baton that had been appraised was repackaged together with the package and the application for identification. It was then placed in the huge underground storage room of the 17th Research Institute. Its historical mission seemed to have come to an end at this moment. According to the Federation's regulations on evidence, if there were no major accidents, it was destined to quietly stay in this huge gloomy, dark, and quiet storage room for the rest of its life. It would never be able to leave again until it was gradually forgotten by people. 1 day, 2 days. 1 month, 2 months. It stared at its companions who shared the same fate as it in loneliness. It did not know how many years it would have to stay in this place. Fortunately, the Federation's conditions were good. It did not have to worry about being covered in the dust of history and annoying spider webs. The river of time moved forward silently. It was the spring of the 65th year of the constitutional era. It had been 2 years since the stun baton arrived at the 17th Research Institute in the capital ring. Suddenly, a thin hand picked it up again. Chen Yijiang, a student who had just graduated from the National Xianglin University, passed the Federation's recruitment and entered the 17th Research Institute. Then, he was sent to the storage room to manage it. This new employee who was still passionate was obviously not corrupted by the stale bureaucratic atmosphere. He still maintained his curiosity about things. He had been in the storage room for 40 days. He was in the middle of recataloguing the evidence. Then, he saw the transparent vacuum bag and the metal shaft inside the bag. There's actually a stun baton hidden in the crystal screen. Interesting. Chen Yijiang laughed. Then, he began to register the evidence. However, after the registration, he did not put the evidence back in its original place. This was because he especially liked to make small things by himself in school. At this time, he felt that this evidence was very interesting, so he was interested in studying it. As the research deepened, it was normal for the Federation to re-examine the evidence. However, no one was willing to do this kind of extra work without overtime pay. 3 days later, Chen Yijiang, whose eyes were full of joy, finished a paper and posted it on the Research Institute's website. The title of the paper was Structural Characteristics of Evidence Number, AW3278. Naturally, such a boring paper sank to the bottom in an instant and did not attract any attention. In a particularly quiet area in the capital of the Federation, there was a department with the highest security level in the Federation. From the balcony of this department, one could see the building of the Central Management Committee of the capital and the President's administrative palace in the distance. However, none of the staff in black suits who were in a hurry would cast envious glances in that direction. This was because they were the staff of the Bureau of Proclamation and shouldered the most glorious mission of the Federation Society. In the core area of this building, in an empty room, a two-dimensional information display light screen was flashing non-stop in mid-air. The most sophisticated computing and searching ability of human civilization allowed the images on the light screen to flash by at a terrifying speed. No one could see the content on the light screen with the naked eye except for the central control computer that was performing the computing and searching. Countless streams of data in the Federation Society were being selected and analyzed here. Whether it was the struggle between the various political parties or the offensive posture of the anti-government army, all kinds of information were being gathered here. Of course, the most important information now was in the Westwoods area. No one knew if the Empire would start another war. Suddenly, the images on the light screen slowed down and stopped on a picture. The picture was a screenshot of a small paper written by a researcher. Then, the light screen showed the location where the evidence number AW3278 was stored. Alarms began to sound in the most secure Bureau of Proclamation in the Federation Society. Chapter 16. Beep beep, beep beep. The gentle yet urgent alarm rang through the entire Bureau of Proclamation. The staff in black suits raised their heads in astonishment and stared at the crystal screens in all directions of the building. Apart from the Empire's sudden attack last time, the Bureau of Proclamation hadn't issued a Level 1 order in a long time. What exactly happened? Amidst the alarm, the central computer's light screen began to flash again. A printed copy of the thesis and its analysis had already appeared directly on the Bureau of Proclamation's director's desk. The alarm that had already shocked the entire Bureau of Proclamation didn't cause the old man's expression to change in the slightest. He coldly glanced at the contents of the document, and the corners of his lips curled slightly. After disappearing for 12 years, he finally showed his tail. The Bureau of Proclamation's director wasn't shocked by the name on the document. In his long life, who knew how many major events he had encountered? The director handed the document to the civil official beside him, stood up, and ordered, "Notify the President's office and the Ministry of National Defense." The civil official was a middle-aged man. He took down his windbreaker from the hanger and draped it over his immediate superior. His heart was slightly shocked. The alarm that rang through the Bureau of Proclamation was enough to prove that the current situation was determined by the central computer to be a Level 1 incident. However, the director didn't seem to care. But if he really didn't care, why did he notify the President's office and the Ministry of National Defense? The Bureau of Proclamation's director leaned on his cane and walked along the quiet passageway toward the outside of the Bureau of Proclamation. The middle-aged civil official silently followed behind him. His eyes quickly swept over the document, and then he saw that name. Euphone. Euphone. The middle-aged civil official's pupils immediately constricted. He thought of the war from more than 10 years ago, as well as the most shocking event of that war. It turned out that the central computer had found Yufeng's whereabouts. No wonder the director immediately notified the President's office and the Ministry of National Defense. Back then, the former president swore in front of the cameras of the Federation's television station that he would definitely capture this traitor who colluded with the Empire and buried more than 10,000 elite soldiers of the Federation. The Ministry of National Defense, on the other hand, was under enormous pressure because of the appearance of such an unforgivable traitor in the military. If they were to find out that the mechanic, Yu Feng, was still alive and well in a certain street in Donglin district, the entire military would probably be enraged. Through the portable communication device, he immediately notified the President's office and the Ministry of National Defense. The middle-aged civil servant took a few steps forward and stood behind the director. He said in a low voice, "The meeting is at 2:00 in the afternoon. I'm going to play golf with someone this afternoon." The director waved his hand and continued to walk forward with the help of his crutch. He did not even stop walking. The Bureau of Proclamation found the mechanic. As for whether the Department of Defense sent the army or the President sent the special task force to capture him, what does that have to do with us? You will attend the meeting in my place this afternoon. The middle-aged civil servant was stunned. His current position was only the assistant to the director. According to the secret meeting of the Bureau of Proclamation, he had no right to speak on behalf of the Bureau of Proclamation. But out of habit, he did not object, nor would he fearlessly criticize the director for only thinking about playing golf under such circumstances. He calmly replied, "Yes, I understand." The middle-aged civil servant respectfully watched the director's old but still tall figure disappear around the corner. Only then did he stand up straight. He was not surprised by the director's calmness or even indifference. He did not find it strange that the director ignored the joint meeting in the afternoon. It was because he knew that as the director of the Bureau of Proclamation, he had enough qualifications to look down on the aides in the President's office and the officials in the Ministry of National Defense. Moreover, the family behind the old director was one of the oldest and most respected among the 7 great families. The old director of the Bureau of Proclamation sat on the battery-powered scooter behind the building. He tossed his crutch to his secretary and looked back at the building he had been in for many years. A trace of doubt and unease suddenly welled up in his heart. That mechanic, Yu Feng, was indeed the most famous traitor in the Federation's 300 years of history. But this kind of thing could have just been sent directly to the Ministry of National Defense, which had been accumulating anger for more than a decade. Why did the central computer have to send a first-level command? A trace of inquiry flashed through the director's pair of deep and calm eyes. In the eyes of these important figures in the Federation's upper echelons, no matter what kind of heinous and earth-shattering things the mechanic, Yu Feng, had done in the past, he was still just a small character. He was not willing to spend any more time on this matter and stop thinking about it. Not long after he left the Bureau of Proclamation, in the Bureau of Proclamation's most heavily guarded central control room, the light screen was still flashing incessantly. In the empty room, there was a strange smell. A line of small words flashed on and off at the bottom of the light screen. There was no record of anything. The line of small words read, "First-level target, re-entering vision." At 12:15, an entirely black fleet of vehicles entered the 17 Research Institute in the outskirts of the capital. Under the shocked gazes of the bespectacled researchers, the staff of the Federation's Investigation Bureau sealed off the storage room and brought back the researcher, surnamed Shen, who had just graduated from university, for investigation. At the same time, the evidence serial number AW3278 was also carefully sealed. Meanwhile, the deputy director in charge of this matter also helplessly boarded the black car. At 2 in the afternoon, a small meeting was held on the third floor of the Bureau of Proclamation. The middle-aged civil official who represented the director of the Bureau of Proclamation at the meeting distributed the documents to the heads of the various departments who were already in the know. Then, he calmly said, "The central computer has given a first-level command. Although it is a machine's analysis, there should be some logic to it. Although it has already been more than a decade, the Federation will definitely not allow any criminal to escape the punishment of the law, let alone the fact that Yu Feng committed the crime of treason." A colonel from the Ministry of National Defense said with a gloomy expression, "This is a disgrace to the military. The minister has instructed that this matter must be handled by the Ministry of National Defense. It's not a problem who is in charge. The president's office had only sent a mid-level official today." He looked at the colonel from the Ministry of National Defense and said seriously, "The key is to capture that person. Mr. President does not know about this matter for the time being. The security consultant believes that since this mechanic was a top student in the military academy and had many friends in the military, and because of these connections, he was able to escape, this arrest operation should still be handled by the Special Task Force, with the Ministry of National Defense assisting. Everyone's goal is the same, so there is no need for too much debate. Why don't we take a look at the plan of action drawn up by the Bureau of Proclamation?" The middle-aged civil official from the Bureau of Proclamation calmly pressed a button, and the plan appeared on the large screen on the wall. Although this mechanic is a minor character, if we want to capture him and bring him back to the capital for trial, it will not be so easy. The central computer recommends, this operation will be carried out by the 4th Military Region of the West Woods, with the assistance of the East Woods Police Headquarters. The 4th Military Region. The colonel from the Ministry of National Defense nodded, very satisfied with this arrangement. Since it was a suggestion from the Bureau of Proclamation, the President's office would not have much of an opinion. What if there is resistance? The official from the President's office said with a gloomy expression, "This mechanic is not only a disgrace to the military, but also to the entire Federation. If there is any resistance, kill without mercy." Chapter 17. A huge commercial spaceship was suspended in the boundless universe. Its light silver exterior and extremely streamlined and beautiful shape made this spaceship become the brightest star under the starry sky. It calmly and gracefully looked at the planet below. Due to the scarcity of energy crystals, interstellar travel was extremely expensive today. This spaceship from the Goo Clock Company from the West Woods region attracted the attention of countless officials and residents of the East Woods region. Other than routine business activities, the Goo Clock Company also brought along friendly greetings from the West Woods region and relevant officials for a visit. However, including the visiting scholars and officials from the West Woods region, most of the important people in the East Woods region did not know that in the control room at the back of this commercial spaceship, there was a large warehouse hidden. Inside, there was a large pile of items covered by military green tarpaulins. No one knew what they were. Lake was the leader of the 4th Military Region's Special Mecha Team. He was just over 30 years old and was at the peak of his strength. He looked at the planet below through the porthole, his expression firm, his eyes filled with calm confidence. Regarding the secret mission of the mecha team this time, other than him, not many people knew about it. Even those members with outstanding military achievements did not know the inside story behind it. Mecha Master Yufeng, this was really a name that left a deep impression. Lake's eyes narrowed as he recalled that explosion more than 10 years ago. At that time, he had still been a new recruit who had followed the Federation's counterattack force and successfully performed a risky space jump, attacking and occupying a resource planet in the heart of the Empire. However, no one would have thought that this was a trap set by the Empire. Countless Empire soldiers swarmed over in battleships, and the huge explosion in the military supply warehouse directly destroyed the lives of more than 10,000 people in the Federal Army, indirectly destroying the confidence of the Federal Army. If the Bureau of Proclamation had not finally found out that the mecha master named Yufeng had played a sinister role in this huge explosion, and it was also this mecha master named Yufeng who had handed over the deployment of the Federation's defensive forces to the Empire, today, the Federation would probably still be in pain and suffering, not knowing how that failure had come about. What a damned, no, a shameless bastard who should have died 10,000 times. Lake thought to himself. However, as a soldier of the Federation, he felt that he should personally capture this mecha master and then send him back to the Federation to be judged in front of tens of billions of people. The only strange thing was that the secret order he received from the Ministry of Defense at the beginning was to capture this person and kill him if he resisted. However, on the second day after he arrived in the airspace above the Donglin district, he received a new order, to execute this traitor directly. This order was sent directly through the highest level of intelligence channels, so Lake did not have any suspicions, nor did he have any thoughts of resistance. He put on his sunglasses and looked at the pictures and words that flashed across the lenses. The corners of his lips curled up slightly. Class 1 Fugitive Yufeng, alias Feng Yu, hid in a repair shop in the 4th Street of Xianglan Avenue, the capital of Heshi State in the East Woods region. He repaired electrical appliances for a living. Lake's curled lips gradually smoothed out. He already knew enough about this mecha master. His social connections were all in the data. However, he did not understand why this traitorous mecha master had hidden in the East Woods region for more than 10 years instead of choosing to go to the Empire to enjoy the rest of his life. After confirming the mecha master's location in the East Woods region for the last time, Lake slowly turned around and said coldly to the 10 team members behind him, all of the target's social connections are already under the surveillance of the East Woods region police. All we need to do is kill him. Yes, sir, the 10 team members replied swiftly, causing the entire cabin to reverberate with a murderous intent. Lake took off his sunglasses and pressed the transmitter in his hand. A radio wave was sent to the East Woods region. From this moment on, the East Woods region police headquarters began to sweep the periphery, while the East Woods region garrison received direct orders from the Department of Defense to secretly cooperate with this group of people. Don't underestimate your opponent. The data you see now is not complete. This mecha master named Yufeng has never obtained a perfect grade in the 2nd Military Academy, but that is because he is not a student at all. He is the first military instructor in the history of the military academy who has never studied before. Lake looked coldly at his subordinates who were reading the target's data for the first time and said fiercely, back then, the Federation sent out 100 elite soldiers to capture him, but he still managed to escape. If any of you dare to be careless, I will kill you directly. After saying this, he walked to the front of the green military tarpaulin, took a deep breath, and forcefully lifted the tarpaulin, revealing the strangely shaped, metallic, murderous mecha. Move out. Soothing piano music was playing in the coffee shop at the corner of the street. Sulu, whose face was full of smiles to the point that his eyes were almost disappearing, strolled along Bell Tower Street to the music while greeting his neighbors in a friendly manner. Indeed, the word strolling should be used, because the tips of his feet seemed to be dancing in some kind of dance, completely unlike the steady and honest appearance he used to have. 2 years had passed, and the lives of the residents of the East Woods region had not changed much. The coffee shop had not changed, and the bar had not changed. The passage of time seemed to have left no trace in this city at all. However, Sulu had changed a lot. He was the same as the purple-haired girl in the distant capital ring, 2 years older. It was just that Jian Shueier's birthday had the entire Federation's infatuated people paying attention to her, but Su Li's growth, no one cared. Except for himself. In the past 2 years, he had followed the owner of the repair shop to learn about mechanics and brought back countless books from the State University to enrich his brain. Every night, he would perform the horse dance and perform a stiff dance. Even someone as slow as him could tell that his body was becoming more and more like the #1 machine that Feng Yu had described. It was becoming more and more obedient to his own commands. In the past 2 years, the residents of Bell Tower Street and Xianglan Avenue knew that there was a kind, studious, and hard-working young man in the repair shop. However, Sulu himself did not feel anything. He just lived an honest life, and when he saw that his neighbors needed help, he would lend a hand. The reason why he was so happy today was because he had successfully passed the written test of the National Defense Department's military officer recruitment exam and entered the second round of conscription process. He had just celebrated with a black market beer with Li Wei. When he thought of joining the army and learning in the capital ring, Sulu felt that he was one step closer to his life's dream. Therefore, a rare joy appeared on his face. When he saw an old man at the corner of the street who was afraid of the sparse traffic, he naturally went up and held the old man's arm. "I'll send you there," Sulu said with a smile. Then, he walked across the street and found that he had sent himself into danger in the alley leading to the repair shop. A group of fully armed soldiers wearing standard helmets and dark-colored silk bulletproof vests surrounded him. The terrifying smell of iron and blood was particularly frightening in the quiet environment. Black, gloomy, and hard gun barrels were aimed at Su Li's head. The nearest gun barrel was directly poked into his temple, and it was extremely painful. Chapter 18. Because of the existence of space dust, the sky in Donglin district was never bright and blue like a picturesque scene. Naturally, it was difficult for the blazing sunlight to dazzle people. But at this moment, Sulu thought he was dazzled by the sun. Otherwise, why would there be a large group of wolf-like, fully armed, and ice-cold soldiers in the quiet Zhonglo street? What was even more absurd was why these soldiers would point their guns at him. A soldier wearing a black cotton mask seemed to say a few words to him, but when it entered Su Li's ears, it became a buzzing sound because he didn't wake up at all. He opened his mouth woodenly and looked at everything around him stupidly. With a bang, a soldier smashed his head with the butt of his gun. A stream of blood flowed out. Su Li's body swayed, but he didn't fall to the ground. Instead, it was the smell of blood and the pain on the left side of his head that made him wake up. He confirmed that he was in an extremely absurd situation. This group of fully armed soldiers were pointing their guns at him. The gun barrel that was still pressed against his temple was incomparably cold and hard. Sulu was naturally calm and steady, but after all, he was only a 17-and-a-half-year-old orphan. Facing the gun barrel so close to him, he shuddered at the thought of a careless movement that could make his big head become a half-rotten watermelon by the metal bullet fired from the gun barrel. So, he shivered and trembled. His thighs twitched as if an electric current had passed through them. Fortunately, he didn't wet his pants. Name. The buzzing sound from the already impatient soldier's mouth finally became a clear and cold-blooded question. Sulu subconsciously replied with a trembling voice, Sulu. A flat metal detector extended to the back of Su Li's neck and stuck to his skin. A chill from the depths of his heart made countless small bumps appear on his skin again. Among the beeping sounds, the data collector in the shortest amount of time read the data of the chip in his neck and transmitted it back to the branch database. It confirmed his identity and all the records from his birth to this day. Target 2 confirmed. The soldier who asked the question coldly said into the communication device. Then, he grabbed Su Li's hair and violently pushed him into an armored vehicle at the back of the alley. Sulu didn't struggle because he knew it was useless. Although the soldier who grabbed him didn't seem to be stronger than the bison in the sanctuary, the dozens of cold gun barrels around him were too intimidating. He did not shout for help either. All these years, he had always wanted to pass the National Defense Officer examination, so he had a certain understanding of the military. Naturally, he could clearly distinguish that these silent and solemn soldiers were real and not daring kidnappers who dared to impersonate the Federal Army. But he did feel insulted, because being dragged by the hair on the ground was a very insulting posture in itself. It only took a very short time for Su Lu, whose face was covered in blood, to figure out why these soldiers had come. It seemed that Uncle Feng's identity had finally been exposed. But Uncle Feng had been hiding in this city for more than a decade. Why would the Federal Army suddenly find traces of him? And why would a mere mechanic who escaped from the military attract so many fully armed soldiers to come and arrest him? The ones in charge of arresting Su Lu were the garrison troops of Donglin. After they dragged the young man into the carriage, they tied a special plastic wristband around his wrist and covered his face with a black cloth. After that, they no longer paid any attention to him. The vehicle started moving. Su felt a burning pain on his wrists, and the wound on his forehead was still bleeding. Such rough treatment made the youth realize that he was facing a truly heartless state machine. He would not make any meaningless resistance. He could only silently calculate in his heart where this military vehicle was going. The military vehicle stopped. No soldiers paid any attention to the poor youth. There was not even a sound. The tough quality of the Federal Army was evident. In this long and unbearable silence, Su Lu, who was huddled in the corner of the vehicle, was as pitiful as an abandoned shrimp. Angry footsteps crushed an ammo box outside the military vehicle. The angry voice scolded the soldiers around the vehicle until they could not raise their heads. You guys have been keeping an eye on him. Why did you let him escape? What person escaped? Su Lu turned his body slightly, silently praying that the officer was talking about Uncle Feng. Colonel Lake took off the glasses on the bridge of his nose. The fury in his eyes was enough to burn the dozens of fully armed soldiers around him to death, but he forcibly suppressed his emotions. After all, these people who were cooperating with him on the ground were soldiers of the Donglin garrison. Except for this operation, they were not under his jurisdiction. He had enough reason to be angry. In order to capture or kill that mechanic named Yufeng, the Federation had prepared for several months. There had been no problems with the ground surveillance. Why was it that when his mecha squad had just arrived on the planet's surface in a battleship, the mechanic had suddenly disappeared from the repair shop at 4th Street of Fragrant Orchid Avenue? It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when humans were at their laziest. It was also the time when the attack was scheduled to begin, but before the attack began, they suddenly lost their target. Lake felt a chill in his heart. In the temporary operation camp outside the 4th Street, a large ultra-thin light screen had been erected. Countless light dots were moving slowly and quickly. The target circled by a black line and marked as one was flickering in and out of existence on the light screen, making it impossible to catch a glimpse of it. Lake stared at the light screen coldly and did not speak for a long time. He knew the entire process of this operation. From the Bureau of Proclamation finding the taser baton, the Federation's early investigation easily found the deputy director of Heshi Prefecture's second branch, Bao Longtao. Then they found the leader of the orphan gang, Li Wei. Then they found Li Wei's good friend, Su Lu. Finally, they locked onto the owner of the repair shop. From the chip's data, they easily eliminated Su Lu, so the owner of the repair shop was naturally Yu Feng. But Lake did not expect the most wanted criminal of the Federation to have the ability to avoid the glory of the first charter and slip away under the eyes of the surveillance officers in the electronic surveillance network that covered the entire human world. The Eastwood region was too far away from the capital planet. The central computer surveillance could not be real-time, and there was at least a 4-minute delay. The mechanic obviously used this delay to fool everyone. And the opponent must have a way to temporarily block the chip's signal. With this thought in mind, Lake's heart became heavier. He now fully understood why the Bureau of Proclamation Central Computer listed this as a top priority, and why he received the order to kill the target directly. A criminal who could avoid the glory of the charter was a terrifying figure. If the truth of this incident were to spread to human society, it would set off an unquenchable wave. Target 1 was already injured when he escaped, a military officer reported. At this time, the entire planet has completely sealed off all aircraft takeoffs and landings. He can't escape. Even if there is a 4-minute time difference, the encirclement will become smaller and smaller. At most, in one more night, we will be able to catch him. I can't wait one more night, Lake said with a cold expression. Where is the apprentice of the repair shop? Su Lu, covered in blood, was brought over. Lake frowned slightly. He was not very satisfied with the methods of his Eastwood colleagues, but he knew that the situation was urgent. Naturally, he would not say much. He looked at the youth and said coldly, I want to know where your boss might be hiding. The black cloth was pulled down, and the light in the room made Su Lu squint. He looked at the colonel in front of him and maintained his silence. A fist smashed into his abdomen. The intense pain almost made him vomit. However, Su Lu still only squinted his eyes and looked at the soldiers around him, maintaining his stubborn silence. Chapter 19. Su Li's hands were tied behind his back with a high-strength plastic rope. His body was bent forward because of the heavy blow to his abdomen. It looked like a very famous ancient torture pose. Because of the pain, his face was red. The wounds that had been drying up were now bleeding again. He opened his mouth to retch, but nothing came out. This was the effect of the 10th punch. Su Lu still did not say a word. Even though he was heavily beaten to the point of kneeling on the ground, he still narrowed his eyes and looked at the colonel in front of him. He stubbornly pursed his lips and remained silent. Colonel Lake's eyes also gradually narrowed, but his face was as gloomy as before. When the Donglin garrison soldiers made their move, he did not stop them because he had to hurry and find the whereabouts of that damned mechanic. As long as he found that person, his subordinates could kill him in one fell swoop and complete the honorable mission given by their superiors. He suddenly took out a pistol from his waist and aimed it between Su Li's eyebrows. He looked at the stubborn youth and said coldly, I'll give you 3 seconds. 1, 2. Colonel Lake spoke naturally, and his actions were also natural. So natural that everyone thought he would really shoot in the next moment. The Donglin native soldiers in the temporary camp all had expressions of shock on their faces. Su Li's body finally began to tremble uncontrollably. However, after Colonel Lake said 3 times, he still only silently looked forward. His eyes were full of stubbornness and persistence. It was as if he was not afraid of the black barrel of the gun at all. Colonel Lake's pupils contracted slightly. He once again studied the youth seriously. He already had enough information on Target 2, but when he truly faced him today, he realized that all the information was not enough. Not many 17 or 18-year-old youths could face the violent intimidation of the army and still be so persistent with the threat of death. However, the youth in front of him did it. Lake lowered his head and looked at Su Li's trembling legs. He said coldly, "I know you're scared, but why are you still unwilling to speak when you're already so scared?" At this time, Su Li spoke his first words after being arrested by the military. He spat out a mouthful of bloody saliva and said fiercely, "As a citizen of the Federation, I have the obligation to cooperate with the military, but that does not mean that I have the obligation to cooperate with torture." Hearing these powerful words, Colonel Lake's expression changed slightly, and a complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. It seemed that even he did not expect that the reason why this young man was so stubborn was because of such a simple reason. Although the logic in this world was simple, how many people could actually persevere under the gun? Lake was silent for a few seconds. He waved his hand and chased all the soldiers out of the temporary camp. In the quiet room, only he was left standing, and Su Li was half kneeling on the ground. After a heart-stopping silence, Lake slowly said, "Su Li, 17 years old, apprentice at the 4th Street repair shop, Target 2. In fact, I know you very well, maybe even better than you know yourself. I know what kind of person you are. You don't want to hang out with those orphans on the streets because you think bullying the weak is wrong. You have a good reputation in Zhonglo Street and Xianglan Avenue. Everyone thinks you are a kind person. But I didn't expect you to be such a persistent person," Colonel Lake said with a smile. Colonel Lake smiled and said, "In the face of unfair and rough treatment, even if a gun is pointed at your head, you are not willing to cooperate. Such a stubborn and serious person is rare in this world. In the face of wrong things, many people are willing to persevere and resist," Su Li said with his head lowered. Colonel Lake gently clapped his hands and said with slight mockery, "But the question is, what is wrong? If you think what we are doing is illegal, then I can tell you the truth. I hope you, a law-abiding citizen, can come to a conclusion based on your own judgment. Then see if you need to cooperate with our operation and tell us the whereabouts of Feng Yu." Su Li lowered his head and was speechless. In fact, he could guess where Uncle Feng was hiding. The secret of the mine, other than the two of them, no one knew. In the past 2 years, the two of them rarely went to the mine. Even if the military monitored it a few months in advance, they might have missed it. Most importantly, after years of hunting bison over the electronic fence, Su Li guessed that the blue signal jammer in Uncle Feng's hand might be able to temporarily avoid the ubiquitous electronic surveillance. It was also because Su Li was thinking that the truth Colonel Lake revealed did not shock him too much. Instead, he fell into deep thought once again. He is a traitor to the Federation. He is a thug with the lives of more than 10,000 soldiers at his hands. Under these circumstances, do you still insist that our methods are illegal? Colonel Lake looked at Su Li mockingly, using this tone and expression to continuously attack the youth's heart. "I don't believe it." After a long silence, Su Li suddenly said, "If he is a spy colluding with the Empire, why is he hiding in Donglin instead of the Empire? You also know that he seems to have this ability." Colonel Lake was silent because he knew that this youth was very relaxed and very simply pointed out the only loophole in this matter, which was also the loophole that he had asked himself on the spaceship. Su Li suddenly raised his head and said seriously, "The court has not announced a verdict, so he is innocent, so I don't believe it." Believing was believing. An uncle who had been with him for 4 years was obviously more trustworthy than these murderous soldiers. But even so, the glory of the Federation's charter still made Su Li's eyes flash with a strong sense of uneasiness. Colonel Lake noticed the change in emotions in his eyes and calmly asked, "Of course we need to try him in court, but the problem is that he is a fugitive. If we don't catch him, how can we bring him to justice? So whether it is for the sake of justice or for the fairness of the law, I need your help." He originally thought that his words would be able to destroy this youth's strong mental support, although he did not understand why this youth believed in procedural justice so much. However, Su Li's next words completely disappointed him. "You are not here to arrest him. I believe that you don't even have an arrest warrant." Su Li looked at this colonel, his eyes narrowed even more, but a sense of unswerving determination seeped out. "You are here to kill him. Even if you are soldiers, you cannot kill without trial, so please forgive me. Unless I can ensure his safety, I will not reveal his whereabouts." Colonel Lake followed Su Li's gaze to those dots of light on the screen. After a moment of silence, he said, "How do you know that we are here to kill and not capture?" These words were a tacit acknowledgement of Su Li's deduction. Su Li sat on the ground, lowered his head and said, "Those blue dots of light are mecha, right? The B4 assault formation has only one purpose, and that is to kill without any way out. Since you only want to kill him, why should I help you? I remember now. You've already signed up for the National Defense Officer examination, but you studied mechanics. How could you recognize the B4 assault formation?" Colonel Lake walked up to Su Li, lowered his head and said coldly, "It looks like I can confirm that you are Yufeng's student. You will be thrown into prison for being an accomplice to treason. Believe me, you will only be able to look up at the starry skies and the battleships in them from prison for the rest of your life." Colonel Lake walked out of the room and ordered the soldiers outside, "Continue questioning." The sound of electricity and the sound of fists and feet hitting flesh rang out in the room. Colonel Lake lit a cigarette and contacted the Bureau of Proclamation in the Capitol Ring. After confirming the general location of Target 1, he issued the order to pursue. At this time, he felt slightly more assured. As long as that mechanic was still within the Federation's range, he was confident that he could find him and bite him to death. Inside the room, Su Li was knocked to the ground by two soldiers. His hair was messy, and his body was covered in blood. No one noticed that his arms that were tied behind his back were gradually trembling. His fingers that were spread out weakly gradually clenched together into a fist. Chapter 20. When Su Li heard that his boss was injured, he began to feel uneasy. Following that, an ominous feeling entered his mind, just like 2 years ago at the entrance of the state university. If the military was able to find his boss because of that stun baton, then Li Wei and the group of orphans would have been captured by now. He understood Li Wei's character very well. If he wasn't forced into a corner, he definitely wouldn't betray his good friend. Is Li Wei okay now? Human rights. What is human rights? Is it the pain in his body, or the hard fists and boots of these soldiers that are even harder? Su Li did not feel any resentment. Although he had always believed in the existence of justice in the world in the past 17 years of his life, he knew even more clearly that if his boss had really committed treason as the colonel said earlier, then in the operation to capture him, all laws and regulations and personal rights would only be overshadowed by the fury of the entire Federation and trampled under the boots of the leather boots of the entire Federation. He was a stubborn young man, but he wasn't a student whose brain was filled with empty words. He didn't expect that he would have the right to hire a lawyer at this time. On the contrary, he understood the actions of these soldiers, but this understanding didn't mean that he was willing to accept it and wasn't angry. But even if he was angry, he wouldn't look at the soldiers who beat him like a wolf cub, because that kind of expression would only bring more pain. He just quietly lowered his head and endured. In his calm, there was actually a great deal of bitterness and uneasiness. Is the boss really a soldier who committed treason? Treason and desertion were two completely different concepts. Although Su Lu believed that Feng Yu wasn't a cold-blooded demon, the anger of these soldiers in front of him made him somewhat uncertain. I want to see Feng Yu and ask him face to face. If all of this is a big injustice, then I'll help him. If all of this is true. A heavy punch landed on Su Li's left cheek, causing blood to spurt out. His gums started to loosen, and the pain stopped him from thinking absent-mindedly. The soldier with the inverted triangular eyes gasped for breath and kicked Su Lu, who was lying on the ground like a dead fish. He walked to the side of the camp and picked up a bottle of water and drank a few mouthfuls. He really didn't expect that this seemingly thin and weak young man would be so resistant. Not only was his willpower firm, he didn't beg for mercy and didn't open his mouth to confess. The most amazing thing was that the young man actually didn't faint under such a heavy blow. The last punch that landed on the young man's left cheek was powerful enough to knock out half a row of teeth. In the end, the soldier's hand was hurt from the impact. Su Lu moved his neck and wiped the blood droplets hanging from his eyelashes on his left arm so that they wouldn't affect his vision. He narrowed his eyes and observed everything in the room, looking for a way to escape. After the colonel and Sunglasses left, there were only 3 people left in the room. And now, there was only one person left. If he wanted to escape, he first had to break free from the plastic rope on his wrist. When Su Lu was being interrogated, he secretly tested it and found that it wasn't particularly difficult. He didn't understand why the army would use this thing to replace handcuffs. The second thing was that he had to crawl into the back window before the soldier in the room noticed him. Through the window, he could see the LED billboard in the distance. Su Lu, who was very familiar with this area, already knew that this temporary camp was somewhere outside the 4th Street. He also knew that as long as he crawled through the window and ran across the grass outside the camp, he would be able to reach the sewer entrance that was never covered. The key to everything was time. Su Lu dared to hope that when he crawled through the window, there wouldn't be a single sound. At this time, the room was surrounded by fully armed soldiers. Although there were not many people on the other side of the window, it still only took 4 seconds for the soldier to notice the abnormality to enter the sewer entrance. Any longer and the bullets would have covered the entire area. It was very risky. Even so, Su Lu didn't want to knock down the soldier in the room to buy more time. The soldiers that appeared today were all the elite special forces of the Donglin Garrison Army. This was easily seen from their military uniform and equipment. He was very clear about the terrifying strength and killing skills of the special forces soldiers. A series of analysis and consideration actually only took a very short time. The soldier with the inverted triangle eyes was still drinking water with his back facing Su Lu. He had to seize this opportunity. The familiar trembling followed a familiar path and moved through the muscles of Su Li's chest and upper arm. The young man's body felt slightly hot, and his upper body trembled like extremely strange ripples. Gradually, the ripples passed to his wrist, and then turned into an extremely concentrated force. With a crisp snap, the plastic rope on Su Li's wrist broke. He climbed up from the ground as fast as he could. Using both hands to support himself, he stood in the same spot. However, he didn't run in the direction of the window. His eyes were filled with despair. He stared at the Special Forces soldier who suddenly turned around and didn't say a word. His despair was because he had misjudged something. When he broke the plastic rope, it made a crisp snap. The Special Forces soldier who was drinking water immediately turned around in alarm. At this time, if Su Lu wanted to crawl out of the window again, even if he wasn't shot by the soldier, he wouldn't be able to buy 4 seconds of time. After the soldier with the inverted triangle eyes turned around, he didn't do anything. He just looked at the young man standing on the ground with his mouth agape. The water in the bottle in his hand was dripping onto the young man's leather boots. It was as if he was shocked by the scene before him. It was as if he couldn't understand how this young man, who had been beaten to the brink of death earlier, could stand in front of him. While he was stunned, a trace of doubt flashed through the soldier's inverted triangle eyes. He subconsciously pounced on Su Lu. He aimed a knee at Su Li's crotch and an elbow strike at Su Li's neck. It was an extremely precise technique of the military. Su Lu, who was already in despair, looked at the soldier who pounced on him like a fierce tiger. His eyes suddenly lit up, like a traveler who had been thirsty in the desert for many days suddenly seeing a familiar green forest. He wasn't familiar with the soldier's movements, but Su Lu was very familiar with this feeling. Feeling the wind blowing against his face, he separated his legs and casually and naturally got into a horse stance. His body leaned to one side and both of his hands reached out. His left hand was clenched into a fist, and his right hand was clenched together. He followed the soldier's elbow and counterattacked. This movement was extremely natural and accurate. It was like eating with chopsticks every day. No one would think that using chopsticks to pick up a peanut was something amazing. The next moment, with a muffled sound, Su Li's left fist smashed into the soldier's armpit. His right hand, on the other hand, ruthlessly chopped at the soldier's throat. Su Lu didn't know why he used such a posture to counterattack, but his body seemed to have left his control. According to some instinct, without the slightest delay, he quickly took another step forward. He used his thigh to block the soldier's genitals. His left fist drew a curve, went around the soldier's arm, and smashed into the soldier's temple. The middle finger on his fist protruded slightly. The knuckles were slightly red, like a peanut. Chapter 21. The repulsive inverted triangular eyes closed in midair. The soldier who took 3 consecutive hits from Su Lu didn't even make a sound before he fainted. If it wasn't for the fact that this person's resistance to attacks was exceptionally strong, he would have died long ago after his throat was chopped by Su Li's palm and his temple was tapped by Su Li's middle finger. But even so, the soldier's throat was still broken and he was severely injured. Su Lu didn't have time to be stunned. He immediately hugged the soldier's body to prevent him from landing on the ground. Then, he ran to the window as fast as he could. At this moment, he believed that he could definitely buy 4 seconds. He landed on the concrete ground outside the window like a leopard cat. Then, he lowered his body and quickly passed through the green grass and into the sewers in the distance. There were no gunshots as expected. No one even noticed this scene. Su Lu, who had luckily escaped from the encirclement of the special forces, started to run wildly in the sewers. Although he had been keeping a distance from Li Wei and the other orphans for more than 10 years, he was still someone who grew up with hardships. No one in the city was more familiar with the sewers used to hide from the police than him. The light in the wide sewers was extremely dim, but it didn't stop his footsteps. His rapid footsteps echoed in the air filled with a strange smell and humidity, gradually spreading into the distance. Su Lu, who was running wildly, was drenched in cold sweat. The pain from the wounds didn't affect his speed, but his mind was still a mess. He didn't know what had happened. Did he just knock out a special forces soldier? The stench of the wind hit his face, but it didn't wake him up at all. Su Lu couldn't believe what he had just seen. Why did his body instinctively assume such a posture, and that posture just happened to be within the attack range of the special forces soldier? Just like the chip and the base, Su Lu instinctively reached out his hand, but he just happened to dodge the opponent's attack and cleanly hit the opponent's vital point. His instinctive reaction in that extremely short period of time, that strange posture, was equivalent to the special forces soldier delivering all of his vital points to his fist. That strange posture was naturally the stiff dance that Uncle Feng had forced him to practice for 4 years. 2 years ago, he had secretly guessed that this stiff dance was some kind of combat technique in the military. Today, he received some sort of proof. But he had only learned it for 4 years, and he could so easily knock out a Special Forces soldier. How could this set of moves be so simple? Running on the platform of the sewers, the tip of his foot stepped on a puddle of dirty water. The soft splash pulled Su-lo out of his daze. The truth had happened, and there was no need to think about it. An accomplice to the crime of treason. Su-lo stubbornly ran as he wiped the blood and tears off his face. He knew that once he was convicted by the Federation, he would definitely be arrested and sent to prison unless he could find a pirate ship in the black market and escape to Bermuda under the light of the First Charter. Su-lo stubbornly ran and wiped the blood and tears off his face. He knew that once he was convicted by the Federation, he would definitely be arrested and sent to prison unless he could find a pirate ship in the black market and escape to Bermuda. How could Uncle Fong hide in the Federation for more than 10 years? Although the Eastwood district was very far from the capital ring, but the doubt in his heart disappeared as soon as it appeared. Su-lee's heart turned cold again. Even if he had the ability to escape to Bermuda and become a refugee, he would never set foot on the Federation's land again. His parents, who had worked for the Federation until their deaths, and his sister, Hsien-yi, who was buried in Eastwood. I was a man who wanted to live a good life. I just signed up for the National Defense Officer examination and saw the light of going to the capital planet to broaden my horizons and change my life. Perhaps it was because he was running too fast, but Su-lee's heart hurt a little. He lowered his head and continued running. When he raised his head again, he did not stop. He was a young man, a law-abiding, kind, and honest young man. If Fong Yu was really an unpardonable traitor, he might really come and tell those people where Fong Yu was hiding. However, he believed in his boss and teacher. More importantly, he knew that the Federation soldiers and the Eastwood garrison soldiers were not here to arrest Fong Yu. They were here to kill him. His parents and sister died in a mining accident. Did all the officials pay the price? There were already too many unfairness in this world. The stubborn Su-lo insisted that he should stand for certain things. Even if it was a fugitive like the mechanic Fong Yu, he still insisted on the Federation and the law. He had to be given a chance to speak, a chance to open his mouth and defend himself. At the end of the sewer was a dark tunnel. Underneath the stratum of Heshi State's capital, who knew how many years of excavation had turned it into an extremely complicated network of tunnels. In this day and age, if one was not familiar with the underground tunnels, they would never have thought that the outside of the hidden exit of the sewer was directly connected to the long-abandoned mines in the outskirts of the city. Su-lo gasped for breath as he climbed up the old mine cart in the tunnel. Using the dim light, he looked at the time on his wristwatch and prayed in his heart. He did not know how fast information was transmitted between the stars. He also did not know how long it would take for his specific coordinates to be detected by the electronic surveillance network and for the soldiers to obtain them. He had to seize this time to confuse the searchers and find the injured boss. Otherwise, it would be tantamount to leading the army to the boss's side. This was a race against time. To be more precise, this was a race against the glory of the First Charter. When the mine cart moved into the deep distance, Su-lo, who was hiding inside, finally understood what the boss had said back then, and why he hated the First Charter the most. The tracking of Target 2 has already been reported. The Bureau of Proclamation's feedback time needs. Colonel Lake raised his wristwatch and frowned as he looked at the time. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then he loudly reprimanded the Special Forces soldiers around him. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Find him. Find the mechanic. After roaring these words, he took off his sunglasses and looked back at the plastic wire that was torn in half and the Special Forces soldier who was being treated. He was silent for a long time. Letting go of Target 2 was also one of the backup plans. But before he made up his mind to carry out this plan, the young man gave him a big surprise. A 17-year-old youth was actually able to break through the military's high-strength plastic. It was really too unbelievable. How did he do it? Colonel Lake's face gradually calmed down, but the sunglasses in his hand gradually changed shape. Chapter 22. Compared to breaking the high-strength plastic, the SWAT soldier's unconsciousness did not surprise Colonel Lake. How could a SWAT soldier resist a young man with such explosive power? In all his life, Colonel Lake had only seen it a handful of times. When he thought of this, Colonel Lake became even more curious and murderous toward the mechanic, Yu Feng, the disgrace of the army. The young man was already so strong, so how strong would the mechanic be? However, he did not waver in the slightest. Just like Su Li's belief, Colonel Lake did not care about the strength of the target. He believed that no matter how strong the target was, they would still be vulnerable in the face of the powerful weapons of the federal military. Throwing his sunglasses to the ground, the colonel walked to the front of the command light screen of the temporary camp and silently watched the flashing green dots on the light screen. There were also two completely different color areas. The red and blue areas represented the possible hiding places of Target 12. However, due to the time delay in locating the target, it could only gradually spread out. As the command signals from the capital ring continued to be transmitted back, the red and blue areas on the light screen gradually shrank. Colonel Lake coldly watched this silent but thrilling process, waiting for the moment when the two areas on the light screen finally converged into a fixed point. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Colonel Lake's pupils suddenly shrank. He knew that he had made an extremely stupid mistake. The identification and location between the Eastwood region and the capital ring was a back-and-forth process. If he wanted to locate Target 1 or Target 2, it would actually take more than 8 minutes. His face was extremely gloomy, but he did not say anything to his subordinates. He just felt extremely embarrassed. He thought of the mistake the 4th Military Region made when they first came to the Eastwood region countless years ago. That mistake caused the 4th Military Region to be directly transferred from Eastwood to that primitive and backward place in the West Woods. Today, he made another mistake. Did this represent some kind of ominous sign? If there were military staff or intelligence personnel around, this kind of stupid mistake would naturally not be made. However, the problem was that Colonel Lake was a frontline combatant. In order to maintain the confidentiality of this operation, he did not follow the procedures to organize the staff headquarters. I have to hurry. Colonel Lake stared at the two color areas on the screen that were gradually approaching each other. He thought that as long as the deepest part of the two color areas overlapped, it would roughly be the rendezvous point of targets 1 and 2. Inform me as soon as you locate him. Everyone, prepare to move out. Colonel Lake handed over the work of setting up the temporary camp to the Donglin garrison troops. He notified the team members hidden in the city through the shoulder communicator. He then sat on the armored military vehicle and headed toward the depths of Heshi State City under the twilight. Su Lu scrambled down from the cart. He didn't notice the knee-deep black water in the tunnel. He found the steel ladder and desperately climbed up. He had to save all the time he had. When he reached the top, he smashed the lid open and climbed out. He skillfully raised his elbow and pushed the extremely thick electric switch up. A burst of bright light illuminated the entire room. It was the operation room of the mine where the teenager had stayed for 4 years. He opened the dustproof door of the room, passed through, and came to the living room. He then saw a familiar person leaning on the sofa in a familiar posture. The repair shop owner, Feng Yu, seemed to have no bones. He lazily sunk into the soft sofa. The pure silver lighter in his hand had just been extinguished. The smell of kerosene seemed to be floating in the air. The cigarette in his dry lips had just been lit. The butt was bright red, but he didn't have time to release the smoke. A fugitive trader greeted his closest employee and apprentice in this city in such a posture. Amidst the absurdity, there was a comforting sense of stability. Sulu, whose face was covered in sweat and blood, stared at him in a daze. Looking at the miserable wound on his thigh, he didn't wait for his breath to calm down. He opened his mouth and asked, "How much time do we have?" Feng Yu raised his eyelids a little weakly. He glanced at the little guy who had accompanied him for 4 years. He smiled slightly and said, "It takes at least 8 minutes and 24 seconds for the electronic surveillance to track the location of the chip and send it back to the Bureau of Proclamation on the capital planet. After that, it will be accurately located and sent back to the execution team here. You came here by the minecart. The speed is not bad, but the positioning system has been following you. In about 6 minutes, it will be able to find your trace through the sewer pipe. Calculating this, you have about 3 minutes to talk to me. I didn't expect you to be able to escape." Feng Yu's somewhat pale face was full of pride. "It seems that the trash of the Department of Defense can't compare to the things that I casually taught. I just didn't expect you to actually dare to escape and be willing to come to me." The two of them knew very well that Sulu dared to escape from the control of the military, which was equivalent to putting himself on the opposite side of the Federation. For this, he would have to pay an extremely heavy price. However, Feng Yu's face still didn't show any signs of being moved. There was only calmness. 3 minutes can't be used to chat. After all, I'm not ready to hear your last words. Sulu lowered his body and dug out a few green military weight belts from under the sofa. He was ready to tie Feng Yu up. "I'll carry you and run." Feng Yu clearly had no interest in being a dumpling. He gently patted Su Li's hand. A trace of guilt flashed through his eyes. He said, "You can't escape. I originally thought that if you didn't come, you would at most be detained for a few days. After all, the Federation government is not the barbarians of the Empire. They can't do everything so barbarically. I know you can block the electronic surveillance." Sulu looked at his boss's face with some unwillingness and even anger. He said, "I haven't even tried." "How do you know I can't escape?" "Because I've been escaping for more than 10 years. Feng Yu coughed twice. He smiled and took out a small tool from his bosom. He stuffed it into Su Li's jacket pocket and said, "That thing you're talking about can only maintain the blocking ability for half an hour. It can't be used forever." "What happens after half an hour?" "Heshi province is only so big. Instead of running in vain, it's better to spend these few minutes properly." Su Li's hand that was holding the military weight belt stiffened in midair. He looked at Feng Yu's haggard face and said through clenched teeth, "You can hide from the First Charter for more than 10 years. Why can't you continue to hide?" Feng Yu didn't answer this most important question. He looked at the youth with a faint smile and asked, "With your personality, it seems that you forgot to ask me something." Sulu lowered his head and asked, "What was the explosion on the battlefield all those years ago? Are you really a spy for the Empire?" His question was very direct. Feng Yu's answer was also very direct. The uncle blew out a smoke ring and said lazily, "Of course not. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."